or something?
Yeah, you just want to acknowledge that we're being live streamed. Hey, everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. My guest today is back by popular demand. In fact, he is so popular when he's on. He's a medical doctor named Peter Rogers that we are creating a monthly slot for him starting in December. So we'll let you know all about that. Be sure to be on my mailing list at chefaj.com because once a week, we simply send you the schedule of who's on and what they're talking about. And I know you won't want to miss Dr. Rogers because we get so many questions when he's on. Today, he's going to be talking about how you can increase your IQ and prevent dementia, something I think that everybody wants to do. Please welcome back to the show, Dr. Peter Rogers.
Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
You know, Dr. Rogers, it's so funny, right? I recently watched one of your fabulous videos on your YouTube channel called Does Marijuana Make You Stupid? So I'm wondering if that's going to come up in today's discussion.
Yeah, actually, I could mention a few things about that. Yeah. I looked it up. I was surprised. The side effects are much worse than I had previously thought.
Right. Well, I think people need to know that you really are an expert on this because you spend your days working as a medical doctor, literally looking at thousands of brains.
Yes, I look at all the brains and then I find it especially interesting whenever I get a brain that I can't explain. It's not the obvious usual diabetes, hypertension, which is the vast majority of them. And I find unusual things. And I talk to neurologists a lot. You know, why do we think this patient is cognitively impaired? And, you know, substance abuse is right up there. If it's diabetes and hypertension cause the vast amount of dementia, I think are the main risk factors I see. But I get a lot of brains too, where, you know, no one knows why is this patient so cognitively impaired. And substance abuse is a major contributor to that.
Can't wait to see the presentation.
Okay, I just have the down button here. Okay, so I started out with a picture of Harvard. I actually had a picture of all the Ivy League schools because what I was thinking about was, you know, when it comes to chronic disease, basically by definition, a chronic disease means that it cannot be cured. The patients are on pills for life with hypertension, diabetes, and many other conditions. I said to myself, well, gee, the vegans, we can cure lots of those. Okay, how do I go to the next slide? Okay. And so I said to myself, gee, our audience members, Chef AJ, you and other vegans, we can actually cure diabetes if you catch it early enough. If you catch type 2 diabetes before the patient's insulin dependent, while they still have a decent amount of insulin production from their beta cells, it can be cured. And then that's also the case for hypertension. If they, you know, lower their dietary salt and they also decrease their dietary fat, quite often hypertension can resolve. You know, Dr. McDougall and Nathan Pritikin and others, Walter Kempner, they get lots of their patients to come off their pills. So it reminded me too of a funny quote by Martin Luther: "A simple layman with scripture is superior to the Pope and his councils without scripture." So my takeoff on that would be an educated layman with a low fat, low sodium, whole food, 100% vegan, no oil, no sweets, no caffeine, no alcohol, can cure more chronic disease patients than any Ivy League expert. It's true. Autoimmune disease. I've gone through all the textbooks. I have a pretty boring life. So I sit there and I'll sometimes go through the textbook. I'll see, what does it have to say on this? Because I can remember when I was a medical student, I was like in awe of these big textbooks, often written by Ivy League authors and stuff. I'm like, wow, this is the ultimate truth in this subject. And then what I realized was, gee, you go through the autoimmune disease chapter, there's nothing on leaky gut. That's the most important thing to be aware of. There's more to it than that, but that's the most important thing. Cardiovascular disease. There's no mention of, you know, Dr. Esselstyn and related work, Dr. Ornish, and additional physicians along those lines, like Walter Kempner, as well as Nathan Pritikin and whatnot. In addition, you know, Esselstyn has the best results in the world for treatment of coronary disease. So the point I'm getting is to empower the audience to realize this vegan diet is extremely powerful to improve your health. And I joked then to another quote of Luther: "If I am shown my error, then I will be the first to throw my books into the fire. I do not accept the authority of popes and councils, for they have been contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand. I can do no other. So help me God, amen. Let the vegan reformation begin." So, all right. Anyways, I'm kind of kidding with that, but what I'm saying is the Ivy League would never want to debate a vegan because it's so obvious that the vegan diet's more powerful than anything they have for chronic disease. But I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a second pattern, which I jokingly call the Cold War. I had slides for this that were funny. And what I mean by that is there's going to be an end around. You know, to make money, it's very good for the economy to have a lot of fat people. In fact, the economy kind of runs on fat people in terms of health and a lot of things. So what I'm saying is, I think that I've seen on the internet tremendous promotion of high fat plant-based diets. And I think that's going to be the new thing. I think low fat, low sodium vegan is much healthier, but I think that the high fat is going to, you know, catch people for animal rights and other things, and it'll keep people fat and sick. So it'll keep, you know, the hospitals full, the clinics, the pharmacies full. But just so people know, there's tremendous amount of proven data on the low-fat vegan diet. For example, we talked before about the Pima. They were absorbed into Arizona after Mexican-American War in 1848. The Tarahumara have remained in northern Mexico, right by Sierra Madre Mountains and Copper Canyon. And the point is, they are eating the standard American diet, high-fat diet, tons of diabetes, obesity, all the usual stuff. And you know, you end up getting drugged or surgerized after 50 if you're still eating a high-fat diet. And you know, typical thing, you see this all day long, every day. Open heart surgery, we call it a cabbage, coronary artery bypass graft, gallbladder surgery in this quadrant, appy in the right lower quadrant. Okay. All right, buddy. Hey, I'm kind of jumping around. Can you take me back a slide here? Okay, there we go. All right, so, and then the Tarahumara, Pritikin patterned himself after them because they can run 100 miles in 2 days. They're eating corn and beans and squash and local greens. So that's just one more example of how powerful it is. Take a look at Caldwell Esteson's diet. It's about 10% fat. Take a look at Dr. McDougall's diet. It's about 7% fat. Walter Kempner would start his patients out on 3% fat. So what I'm trying to say is, you know, the best nutrition experts in the world with the best results have patients on very low fat diets, 10% or less. And everything I've studied about fat tells me you want to be low fat. We'll talk some more about that once we get to some slides on that. Here's kind of like the diet I go by. I call it the, and close the door here. I call it the, sorry about that. I call it the Spartan vegan diet. Spartan because it's really simple and it's kind of real sparse in a lot of ways. That's what I basically do. Raw fruits, I love to eat them. Raw veggies, especially salads. The only thing I do for cooking is I just boil water. You know, potatoes, all your starches, sweet potatoes, rice, beans, oatmeal, quinoa. I only eat organic. One of the things I think is a little different for me than some nutrition experts is I'm worried about the brain. And, you know, like I said, my life's real boring. I just read an entire textbook on the pesticides and herbicides in non-organic food, much worse than one would expect. There's a lady by the name of Stephanie Seneff that talks about them all the time and has written extensively on them. She's this PhD professor from MIT, and one would be surprised. Basically, they mimic glycine and can, it's thought, intercalate into proteins and disrupt their function. What's another thing here? No meat. And I say no meat, not one bite, even though I know native populations will eat small amounts of meat, you know, like 3 to 5%. But the reason I recommend none is you've accumulated toxins and a lot of atherosclerosis over the years, most persons who've eaten a high-fat diet. So it's almost like part of detoxing. Plus, there's a lot of problems with meat, even besides the fat. You get iron overload. They have all the growth factors from all the leucine, for example. They have a different amino acid composition. It's more likely to promote cancer. So you really want to free your body of that. No oil, not one drop. We'll talk about that more, but lipid peroxidation is a big problem with these oils. It damages cells. It even causes, I think it causes brain damage too. I'm going to talk about that once we get a little further advanced. And I recommend no sweets and whatnot. So this is easy to cook. It keeps you healthy. I think it tastes great. Your taste becomes simple. It's cheap, especially the starches. If you want fancier cooking suggestions, you know, you should talk to Chef AJ. That's not for me, but I'm just letting you know that's what I do. And it kind of fits Spartan, like going back with my wrestling background. I'm going to talk some more as we go along with this Rogers theory of dementia. And this is my theory of dementia. And the reason I get into this is a lot of people try to study dementia, neurodegeneration, and how does one prevent it. And they end up frustrated because they run into all this literature on beta amyloid. Beta amyloid is a membrane protein in neurons that has become associated with Alzheimer's, because when they do an autopsy on an Alzheimer patient, they'll find these plaques in the brain in the extracellular locations of multiple beta amyloid proteins all stuck together and precipitated a protein has to be soluble in solution to be functional. So they're non-functional plaques of this beta amyloid. And they thought, oh, gee, that's what causes Alzheimer's. But from my study of it, I think it can do a few things. It can cause mechanical effects on adjacent cells, but it's not even completely clear if it's primarily like a tombstone on a dead neuron rather than a causative event. And after quite a lot of extensive study of neurodegeneration, I think it's primarily a vascular phenomenon with multiple contributing factors. And so the reason for this mnemonic here is partly I'm joking boast in the sense that I figured this out just sitting around reading at my desk rather than all these $1 million research facilities that are trying to market drugs for beta amyloid theory, cascade theory. But so here's what are some of the good stuff. Excessive dietary fat, we'll talk about that more, but basically that deprives the brain of oxygen by about 15%. The brain is super dependent on high levels of oxygen to burn glucose rapidly, so it doesn't like that. Sodium vasoconstrictor. So what you're doing with all these things is you're dropping the blood supply to your brain. It's called OGD for oxygen and glucose deprivation. And basically you want to give your brain the best possible blood supply. If you ever look at a PET scan, you'll see your brain is super hot with tremendous uptake of glucose and the highest metabolism in the body. The only thing close is the left ventricle. So what I'm saying is, most of the time when we talk about health, we say whatever's good for the heart is good for the brain. And what I'm saying here is the brain's even more fragile than the heart. So you want everything to be as good as you can get it to keep your brain cells functioning for a long time. So basically optimize blood flow, glucose delivery, oxygen delivery to the brain, avoid things that cause atherosclerosis. I would also recommend avoiding any type of stimulant. This is why I don't like caffeine, because caffeine mimics acute stress. It increases cortisol. That increases glutamate transmission across the synapse. And I'm going to show you some synapses, all the anatomy of it. This is just to get the overview of it. And so basically, you're increasing the likelihood by raising the metabolic activity of that neuron that it might not be able to meet its energy demands. I got my finger on my ear because I got this earbud from my kid, and I'm afraid it's going to fall out. So anyways, you don't want to ramp that up. Now, there's concerns about MSG and MFG. That's manufactured glutamate. And they hide it in a lot of different names, that might also be elevating the metabolic rate. And let's say your hippocampal neurons of your memory center. So you want to avoid these things. I would avoid aspartame too. That might be contributing as well. Aspartate is a excitatory neurotransmitter. So I would avoid all stimulants. Get your sleep. Sleep deprivation causes the same effect as stress. Increased glutamate transmission across the synapse. And it even has more negative effects. There's glucocorticoid receptors on your hippocampal synapses that are detrimental when they're excessively high. And avoid toxins. Toxins can be things like oils that can damage plasma membranes, mitochondrial membranes. They can also be, of course, sat fat causing insulin resistance, and then all these heavy metal toxins, for example. So we'll come back to it. What I'm basically, though, giving you is what you could do. You're not just a helpless victim of aging. You can avoid all the negative stuff on here, do the positive stuff, exercise, get your sleep, your sun, the usual stuff we talk about, eat low-fat vegan, and dramatically lower your rate of dementia. There's also a lot of medications that cognitive impairments are side effects. So double check your medication list if you're taking any that they're not associated with cognitive impairment. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of things about developing intellectual and skills that were helpful to me and I think might be helpful to you, your kids, your grandkids. Here's my father. He was a psychiatrist. Here's his brother was a physicist. He was another psychiatrist, his other brother. That's me, sophomore year of high school. I was a wrestler. And the reason I show you this picture is my dad's brothers would come over and they would argue about books. They're all off the boat from Ireland. And they used to love to argue about books. And this uncle in particular was a very nasty guy who would always insult us. He especially would insult me. He says, you're as stupid as your father. He would read a book the day before, come over, and then ask us a bunch of questions. The relevance is when I was a kid growing up, it was planted in my brain that you had better read and have something to talk about when the uncles come over, or you're going to be insulted in a very nasty way. And you have to be able to defend your points and arguments. So my parents were both off the boat foreigners. So when I went to high school, I never even took an honors class. But later on, when I went to college, I think having had this experience of, I'd go with my dad to the bookstore and get a couple books to be ready for when my uncle's coming over. So I got used to reading books and being ready to debate them. We talk about the Vietnam War. We talk about all kinds of things. And that was a very useful experience for me. This pretty much sums up my childhood: wrestling and reading books. Those are all, playing sports. And so I got injured my senior year, couldn't wrestle in the state tournament. So the regular Big Ten schools, I wanted to go to Iowa. They didn't recruit me. I had to go to Stanford. And don't get me wrong, it's a great academic school, but I'm from Chicago, so I was really far away. I didn't know anybody. I was so lonely. There was nothing to do but sit in the room. I called my mom, I wanted to come home. And basically, my mother said, stick it out for a year. My dad said to me, he says, you don't realize how lucky you are. Ever since the beginning of time, recorded time, 95% of people have been peasants just trying to scratch a little food out of the ground. You're so lucky to have opportunity to get educated. You should quit complaining and get to work. So anyways, that was kind of the background I had. And I'm like, my mom said, just try for 1 year, you can come home. I said, all right, Mom, for 1 year, I will study as much as I can. I'll try to be like a learning machine. And sort of the loneliness of having nothing else to do, it gave me more time to study. These are my coaches, world and Olympic champion wrestlers. And the biggest thing I learned was from this guy. I'll show you another picture of him. This is Dave Schultz. They're both from Palo Alto, and they then coached at Stanford. When we met him in practice, we ran sprints as a team. He was slow. Then we lifted weights as a team. He was weak, and he was kind of fat. He was out of shape. It was his off season. So the point I'm saying is, I saw these guys. He made himself the best in the world, even though he was fat, weak, and slow. Usually wrestlers strong and all these other things. And so I said to myself, well, gee, you could make yourself into something. You're not just, nobody has to give you anything, give you a title, give you money. And he didn't have that much athletic ability. And so gave me a lot of hope. All he did was maximize technique, kind of like what Bruce Lee is to martial arts. And it made me realize, well, gosh, maybe I could become a good student, because I had some more injuries at the beginning of my college career, and I was afraid I was going to flunk out. And I was pretty sad. And so when I saw Dave, fat, weak, and slow guy, become a national champ and world champ, I'm like, well, gee, maybe I could become good at school. So I started finding the guys who were good students. Here's another guy, my training partner, who's national champion. So I used to get my butt kicked every day in practice. It was pretty miserable, but it gave me the motivation, like the Alfred Adler inferiority principle, to overcompensate in another area. So, well, you know what? If I can't be a great wrestler anymore, I'm going to try to become a great student, become a great scientist or doctor. Exercise makes you smarter. So all this background stuff I show it to you because exercising probably does more for the brain than just about anything. You get increased brain-derived neurotropic growth factor to produce new neurons. Because an animal, when it runs around in a forest, it has to memorize its environment and learn it very quickly in order to survive. So it's designed to make you smarter. If you're reading a book and you're spacing out, you get up and walk, you'll often notice your attention perks up and you can understand the book once again, rather than just, space out at the end of a paragraph. Exercise does lots of other things. The brain actually stores glycogen, especially in the astrocytes. Mitochondrial biogenesis means that new mitochondria will be produced. You'll increase the brain's energy capacity by exercise. So it's about one of the best things you could do, along with the low-fat vegan, to stay healthy. Well, I just included this Frank Longo. If you want to see how neurons interact with each other under fluorescent techniques, it's rather beautiful. They have a hunger for knowledge to connect. If you like the brain, that's a beautiful video there. All right, so I'm going to show you a couple things you can tell if you study yourself, or if you got someone in your family or friends who studies. These are tricks you could do. So I went from, not knowing anything and afraid I'm going to flunk out, to really getting good at school, from learning from other kids that were great at it. I read everything on study skills. I watched all the memory contests. I learned every trick you could know about cognitive development. I studied it. I used outline format condensed notes to put all my notes into one location. So this is for my radiology residency boards. And, I got like in an hour and 10 minutes, finished a 4.5 hour test with a perfect score. And that's like the top 15% of the class in radiology. And so I just show you that because all these students, they pay lots of money to go to college and they really have poor study skills. And the danger is they kind of run into a Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect means that a person is so incompetent, they can't judge their incompetence. And that, in my experience, is a typical college student, because people sometimes send their college students to talk to me when they're having problems in school. And a lot of times they don't understand what I'm trying to tell them. You have to change your whole philosophy of education in order to optimize what you could do. And you have to learn study skills. So condensed notes are a powerful trick. Here's walking while reading. But if you cover up the book and you just walk and talk to yourself, I call it a walk and talk. You try to articulate back everything you've just learned. Like, let's say I just went through the biochemistry of glycolysis. I'll say it back to myself. Glycolysis comes into the cell. It's phosphorylated. You put a charge on it so it can't exit through the plasma membrane. Okay. Anyways, once you can articulate it, you put a copy of that knowledge both into where you speak and to where you hear, and you walk into a test, you can produce all the material. So you're quite relaxed. You go to sleep on time. rather than, the rookies are all doing all-nighters and trying to memorize, they're highlighting. Walk and talk is one of the most powerful study techniques. Also, what I would do before school is I learned for the tough classes like biochemistry, read the night in advance, call it pre-read. You're familiar with all the terms, you can keep up with the teacher. And then I'd sit right in the front row, pre-read front row, that's the way to go. I made hundreds of mnemonics and kept summaries of all those mnemonics. I actually wrote a book about that. Here's my neuroradiology boards. I taped all the pictures from all the journals and other textbooks into one location, because when you get ready for your final exam or your standardized test, it's crunch time. You don't have a lot of time to review. So you want all the material in one spot. And these techniques are super powerful. As soon as I took my neuroradiology boards, the examiner's like, where are you from? Your performance was extraordinary. You got all excited. They don't give you a number for that. I think I got a perfect score on his thing, though. He told my instructor, my boss in my other place. All right, so anyways, here's some more tricks. You've seen this a little bit before, the magic bathroom. Put a textbook on a portable table right in front of number 2 land. Have a paperback for number 1s. Put up pictures of people who inspire you in your bathroom. You need to be inspired. That sort of, remember that book a couple years ago, The Mental Game of Tennis? Well, you need to have a mental game of school. If you believe that your educational efforts are part of something bigger, someday you're going to do something to help the world and whatnot, or whatever it is that motivates you, you'll be able to generate more energy. Because, Einstein for one time said, what is the secret of a great scientist? It's not their intelligence, it's their character, it's their personality. And the people who are really good at stuff, they're enthusiastic about it. They love it. They find it fascinating, and Mozart said, what is the secret of genius? It is love, love, love. And there's really a lot of truth in that, because, like, for example, when I was in med school, I had a friend and he was in another grad school and he's like, oh man, on Saturday I studied 5 hours, man. What a pain in the butt. And I'm like, dude, 5 hours is just a warm up. And because he didn't really want to be in grad school, 5 hours took a lot of effort for him. But if you really find what you're doing fascinating, 10 hours is nothing. So I just say that because a lot of people, if you want to reach your academic goals, understanding these things makes big difference. Okay, yeah, here's another picture of the magic bathroom. And I got this idea from a couple of letters. Mozart, wrote, I think it only fitting to write while shitting. So I said, I think it only fitting to read. And then I saw the Monty Python skit, Every Sperm is Sacred. And that gave me the idea, Every Void is Sacred, to read a paperback. And so, like I said, you heard me say that before, but I read a lot in the bathroom. These are Leitner boxes. Leitner box is a form of spaced interval repetition, another very powerful study technique. I've interviewed guys who graduated first in the class. I graduated first in my school, class too. I didn't learn about flashcards though until I was in residency, and actually till I was done with my residency boards. And so anyways, you put these here in order. So what happens is, if the flashcard's easy, you go and advance it to the next box. If it's difficult, it stays in box 1. And then eventually it gets to completion box. The point being is easy stuff rapidly gets to completion box. The challenging stuff, if there's any hesitation, it stays in box 1. So you keep on reviewing the stuff that's difficult for you, but you quickly go through the stuff that's easy. Because what a lot of students do is they keep on looking at their highlighter notes, and that really doesn't do the same as having to answer a question off a flashcard. I wrote a book about this as well, Straight A at Stanford and on to Harvard, where I go through all this academic stuff and study skills. I wrote another one too about how to raise IQ, become a genius, and a lot of it's joking around. But I learned more after I'd raised my own kids about different things and about what motivates people. In high school, when I hurt my shoulder, I had to run cross country. And I show this because cross country students were by far the smartest kids in my high school. They had all the highest SAT scores. And what's her name? Ruth Heidrich, the famous triathlete lady, vegan. She noticed that she never seen an Alzheimer's patient amongst her runner friends. Running causes neurogenesis. It makes you smarter. Plus, you don't get any head trauma. There's a lot of sports that might be a lot more fun, but you don't want any head trauma. And what's the big thing to watch out to maintain IQs? A lot of parents, they mean well and they put their kid in soccer. I think soccer is like one of the stupidest sports, because the coach goes in the corner to do corner kicks and they got to head the ball, which is like volunteering to be punched in the head, every day at practice. I've seen, star college soccer players have to drop out of college because of head injuries and cognitive impairment. So I think, soccer is a great sport, except for hitting the ball at the head. They really should change the rules so you don't hit the ball at the head. But I think that's partly why a lot of soccer players, as they get older in their careers after many years, they get kind of crazy because they've had so much head trauma. Standardized tests. Basically, another interesting thing is Naperville High School. They have the kids, run like on a treadmill right before math class, and their test scores improved a lot, as much as 20%, they claim. And they repeated that at another high school in Pennsylvania. Standardized tests are really like a memory competition and a speed competition. So if you study for them, you can dramatically improve your score. It's relevant because they consider them essentially like an IQ equivalent. And the truth is, if you study them, like my score when I restudied for it went up about 300 points because I joined cross country and these guys had all done better than me. So I was ticked off about that. So I just got one of the study books, studied it on my own. My score went up about 300 points. And so my IQ didn't change. And that's what I'm getting at. You can change your so-called academic IQ just by study skills and techniques and putting effort in. And it's important to know that. That kind of gets back to the Stanford psychologist lady, Carol Dweck. She calls it the growth mindset. The realization that effort matters and one can improve is a motivator to make more effort. And I also had the experience when I didn't study for MCATs. I was kind of arrogant. I was like, I'm the best pre-med at Stanford. I don't need to study for the stupid MCAT. And then all my fraternity buddies did better than me because they had a study group. I didn't want to join them. I figured I'll just be their tutor. And I ended up being quite embarrassed. I didn't do as well as I should have on that. And they did well. So that was embarrassing. I learned from that. And I like standardized tests though in the sense that, if you're from Podunk, and most people basically are, it gives you a chance to compete with anybody from anywhere. So that's what's good about them, even though I know they're also kind of a cumbersome thing. This is my med school picture. I wrote this book on Medical Students Guide to Top Board Scores about how one can emphasize academics. And by the way, academics at the college and grad school level is mostly a memory contest. So you just get good at memorization. Everything to do with memorization, you want to study that. Let's see, here's when I was at this animal surgery training course. When I was early in my career, I started out being an imaging guided surgeon. And I later switched to being primarily a neuroradiologist. I still do some procedures, but not like I used to. I used to do procedures all day long, every day. This guy is actually a famous guy who helped train me. I wrote a textbook of interventional imaging guided surgery years ago. And then here's how kind of this nutrition stuff started. I got fat when I tried to do 2 fellowships simultaneously. I wasn't sleeping, had a kid with the wife at home. I was up all night. I got up to about 220 pounds and everybody's making fun of me. And my wife's like, oh, it's no big deal. You'll just become infinite, make my life easier, And so I'm like, oh man, my whole family mocked me. And so I tried to just lose the weight on my own for 3 years and I couldn't do it. Then I started making a little progress. Once I decided I'm going to devote my life to studying this stuff because otherwise I'm going to be fat, diabetic, impotent, all this stuff's not good. And then also Dr. McDougall helped me out a lot when he got me to the starch diet. I was making progress, but kind of slow. When I went to the starch plant-based diet, then I got with Dr. McDougall's advice. That's one of the great things that he does. He says, go with starch, low caloric density, all that stuff. That's really a key thing. Anyways, I got skinny. And after all that, I got down to about 154. Now I'm about 165, which I like. Sleep makes you smarter. The brain cleans itself at night. It runs what's called the glial lymphatic system. So that's 2 words. Lymphatic means glial, the supporting cells of the brain. Lymphatic are drainage channels that run parallel to the veins. And it's kind of like neurons at night can pump out their waste products like Victorian English throwing out their chamber pots. The brain cannot clean itself in the daytime because the ionic milieu of the neurons has to be maintained precisely so the neurons can function. They can fire their action potential. But at night when you're asleep, the brain can go offline. The blood-brain barrier permeability opens up, cerebral spinal fluid rinses over the brain. And the point of that, why that's useful to know, is we're smartest in the morning. So whenever you got to do something intellectually challenging, do it first thing when you wake up. That's what I tell young students too, if they ask my advice. Study as soon as you wake up. Train yourself to study as soon as you wake up. It's the smartest you'll ever get. Do not, there's other things that might be nice to do, eat breakfast, work out, and that's fine. But my attitude, study as soon as you wake up, because you'll build up your best smart endurance, by doing that. Trust me, I've experimented with everything you could experiment with about cognitive performance. As soon as you eat a big meal, you feel like you want to sleep. And think about if you're an animal. When does an animal need to be smart? An animal needs to be smart when he wakes up in the morning because he hasn't eaten, since last night at the most recent. So an animal has to be smart when he's hungry. Okay, after a big dinner, the animal might as well go to sleep. So you're designed to be smart when you're a little bit hungry when you first wake up in the morning. You get a cortisol surge, maintains your blood glucose, you get ghrelin going to your hippocampus, activating your alertness. You get sort of just the right touch to give you the ability to do your most challenging academic work. Here's a couple things on helping kids to be smart. Breastfeed as long as you can. Try to breastfeed at least 6 months. Try to be healthy as you could be. Get a water filter. I would say you definitely want a carbon whole house water filter. You want reverse osmosis in your kitchen. Test the water if possible. The best water is high quality well water if you could get it. Talk to your kid a lot. Kids benefit from conversations with adults and older persons. don't worry too much about social and friends. You know, you go to your high school reunion and everybody's got good manners. Hi, how you doing? Nice to see you. Okay, they don't. What I'm trying to say is anybody can learn social skills. Don't get me wrong. Some people have great social skills. But what I'm still trying to say is what I see happen is kids go to their friend's house and then the older brother over there gets them playing video games or gets them to fight or all kinds of stupid stuff, that it's overrated, all this social stuff. I also studied all the lives of lots of all these geniuses and stuff and how did they live. Quite often they had a period of prolonged loneliness in their childhood where they read a lot or practiced their piano or whatever they did. They also often were homeschooled, and those things sort of helped them. They also often had some type of deficit in their life that they compensated for. So having a problem sometimes can be a good thing if it makes you work harder in another way. Vygotsky's principles are good. It's the zone of proximal development whereby an adult, so to speak, scaffolds a task, whatever it might be, you know, building something. Then the kid can imitate the adult and learn. And that's how we learn a tremendous amount of stuff, is by imitating someone else. I think piano is the best instrument for a kid. I actually think you should play classical music for the kid the first year or two of life, you know, peaceful, pleasant stuff, adagios, because they are more likely to develop perfect pitch hearing. You know, all the stuff like going to the zoo, the art museum, science museum, that's good. Let them know their cousins, that helps. Only eat organic food. You'd be amazed at how much stuff you don't want is in non-organic food. I personally believe, you know, avoid this stuff. Okay. Couple thoughts on the brain. Why do animals have brains but plants do not? Because the animal moves. As soon as you start moving, you got to navigate. You got to have a value judgment. I will go towards the fruit tree. I'll avoid, you know, the foxes and wolves over there. You have to find your way back. You have to avoid obstacles. So the classic story is the sea squirt. You know the difference between a sea squirt, the juvenile phase, and the adult phase? In the juvenile phase, it swims around like a tadpole. In the adult phase, it anchors itself to a rock, becomes a filter feeder, and its brain is reabsorbed, because if an animal doesn't move, it doesn't need a brain. So what I'm trying to say, that's another reason why most of the neurons in your brain are devoted to movement, you know, vision, navigation, and balance and coordination. I'll show you a picture of the brain, but 70% of the neurons in your brain are in the cerebellum for movement. So what's the purpose of a brain? So you could walk down a path in a jungle, a forest, a prairie, and you survive. So, and the other thing too, people think, oh, you get your education in school. No, in school, you get your degrees, you have a little memorization contest, but really developing the ability to think, to understand, to do useful things comes from something you develop on your own or later on in, you know, more advanced training stuff. And here's just a couple quotes, thinking quotes that I found really helpful for solving complex problems. There's always a good reason, and then there's a real reason. If you think there's a contradiction, recheck your premises. Contradictions do not exist. Whenever you are finding a contradiction, check your premises, you'll find one is wrong. A lot of times I couldn't understand social things, boom, I look at that and I get it. If you want to understand something, take it out to its extremes, the opposites, and you'll often figure it out that way. So anyways, having these little rules of thumb for thinking, I have a whole bunch of them. I really like the 6 blind men and an elephant. I couldn't get the slide in here, but you ever seen that one? It's sort of like an Indian proverb. One guy's holding the tail, it says, oh, I think it's a rope. Another guy holds the ear, it's a rug. Another one holds the tusk, it's a spear. Okay, and the reason I say that is you want to try to, you know, look at all sides of an issue, read every opinion you can get on it, and then come to a conclusion. So you kind of get like a bird's eye view of the elephant, if you will. And there's many problems that are like that as well. So Aristotle had also said the first thing you want to do in an intelligent conversation is remove your emotions, because a lot of times people are anchored to a position. For example, I would rather, you know, die than stop eating meat. Okay, if you're all emotional and you jump to a conclusion fast, you can't really solve a complex problem. So you have to reserve judgment and absorb all the different points of views. And if you look it up, you'll find it. 6 blind men and an elephant. It's a great metaphor for sophisticated thinking on complex topics. And you know, metaphor is a key thing on how we learn new stuff. The way our brain maps cognitive space is to connect new information to what we already know. And that's partly why you form new neurons. And that's a great secret of how you learn stuff. It's also like, you know, a person has to understand part 1 in order to be able to add part 2 of a new topic. I think it's good for kids to learn how to build stuff instead of just taking Scantron tests. Good to learn how to draw. Drawing is a great skill. You can do it your whole life. And you can connect it to whatever you like. That's why I like playing piano. You could play piano your whole life. I like tennis. You can do that your whole life. Whereas a lot of this other stuff, you know, I was a wrestler and I really liked being a wrestler when I was young, but unless you stay in wrestling shape, you can't wrestle that much when you're older. I still have a mat. I'll wrestle a little bit with my high school nephew, but I'm I can't wrestle like I used to. I wish I had stayed in better shape. This is kind of a famous slide. You might have seen this one before, but this is where my kid in 7th grade, he's going to 7th grade. I come home from work and he says to me, he goes, "You're a bad parent." I go, "Why you say that?" And he goes, "Because you don't help me with the basketball team. The other boy, his dad coaches the team. The other boy, his dad practices with him all the time. He says, all you do is work." And I'm like, "Okay, buddy, I'm sorry. Maybe I can help you. Let me think about it." So while, the wife wasn't home, I knew if I asked her, she'd say no. My carpenter friend boarded up the windows, and we weren't using our living room for anything. Got a wood floor, high ceiling, put in a basketball hoop. Kid practiced 3.5 hours a day, got really good. And I kind of pushed my luck because upstairs I converted one of the bedrooms into a racquetball court. And then we had a basketball court in the backyard. And the wife got really mad at me. She's like, "This house is not a gymnasium." We ended up having to move. But if I could do it all over again, I wish I kept that house. It was great. You could exercise anytime you wanted. She said, "You're breaking the foundation of the house." Yeah. All right. A couple things to watch out for. Head trauma causes cognitive impairment. Watch out for pollution. Kids need to be taught to avoid pollution. They don't need to warm up their cars so much and sit there like an idiot talking right next to the exhaust coming out. Avoid noise pollution. For example, I like to study with quiet, but if I had to listen to music studying, something like instrumental Baroque is good. It's about the only thing I could stand for studying, but verbal music, something with a prominent beat, can't study at all to that. You can't turn your ears off. I'll often wear ear protectors when I'm trying to study because that helps. Quiet. Have some smart friends you can talk to. Watch out for inhalation problems. A lot of these paints are toxic. Any type of chemical that rapidly transitions from liquid to dry or solid is going to give off volatile organic compounds and typically be neurotoxic. Quite often, amphiphilic can pass through both hydrophilic and hydrophobic substances and therefore potentially is neurotoxic. Cigarettes, terrible habit. It makes you age rapidly. Alcohol is a brain toxin. MJ is also a brain toxin. That's not widely recognized, but I've seen patients where it's laced with PCP and they become psychotic. It increases the risk of schizophrenia, causes impaired judgment, increased motor vehicle accidents. It's much worse than is widely recognized. Caffeine, yeah, you've heard me talk about it. It's sort of a minor sin, if you will, dietary sin, but you want to kind of cool down your hippocampus as much as you can. You want to be resilient, sort of what that guy called the anti-fragile. And getting caffeine off the list is one of the things that makes you more so because your hippocampal neurons, they're like the most fragile neurons in your whole brain, and they're the most important neurons. So if you want to protect your brain, protect your smarts, you want to let that hippocampus cool off. What I noticed when I quit caffeine is I felt anxious. Well, first of all, I felt sad for like about 3-4 days, almost depressed because I lost that stimulus. It increases glutamate transmission in the hippocampus and other areas. It mimics the acute stress response. Then I had intense cravings for about 2 weeks, but after that, I was back to normal, and I was really glad to be done with it. That's after 15 years of having 1 or 2 cups a day. It also has a little bit of a cardiac risk attached to it. And by the way, you're going to hear a million great things about caffeine and coffee and tea because they're billion-dollar products. Okay, that's always going to be that way. So go back to basics. This increases caffeine. This mimics the acute stress response. What does acute stress response do? It increases heart rate. It increases blood pressure. It increases cortisol. It increases glutamate transmission in the hippocampus. It also makes blood more procoagulant. Okay, it increases fibrinogen, the major clotting factor in the blood. It increases factor VIII antihemophilic factor. It increases von Willebrand factor. It makes your blood prothrombotic. Think about it. Being chased by a tiger in the dark is how one remembers the stress response. So you don't bleed if the tiger scratches you. So you don't want your blood to be prothrombotic. Get your sleep. Main thing on sleep is go to bed earlier. There's other things to it. All right, here's my family. So my mother's from Puerto Rico. And one of the things I noticed about Puerto Rico is my Puerto Rican cousins, none of them want to come to the States. Most other countries are like, oh, I want to go to America. They're like, screw America. We have a better life in Puerto Rico. And you know what I think it is? It's because of the Rossetto effect. Oh, crap. I cut off. The Rossetto effect means that came from a bunch of Italian families in Pennsylvania. What they found was with demographic matched populations for alcohol and tobacco, they were far healthier. They're living like an extra 10 years or so. And the reason is because they had a support system. If Luigi loses his job, he can go live with his cousin, all right? Versus if he's by himself in the city and he loses his job, he's screwed. He has no money, he can't feed himself, he loses his apartment. So the support system, and that's the Rossetto effect. The town was called Rosetto, really helped people. And that's, I think, what they have. Everybody lives kind of close. It's a small island. So I wish I lived there, but my life's too complicated. I can't live there. But I wish I did. All right. Anyways. Okay, here was what we were talking about. The sea squirt as a juvenile swims around like a tadpole, has a brain. As an adult, it attaches to a rock, becomes a filter feeder, and its brain is reabsorbed. And the same thing can happen to an adult, a human in a sense. When you're young, you go to a family party, all the kids are running around all hyper, and the adults just sit there. When a patient becomes demented, it's very characteristic that they don't move around much. They sit around watching TV, and eventually they just stare out into space, zoned out. So what I'm trying to say is movement is a sign of life. It is good. And so if you can't go to the gym, which most of us can't, make yourself get a standing desk, get a treadmill desk, just stand up, do a couple air squats, whatever it takes. Make sure you're moving at least every 30 minutes instead of just sitting at your desk job, whatever that is. Okay, here's the anatomy of the brain. I don't see how am I doing for time. We got a lot of time. All right, there's 3 parts to the brain. This is the brain stem, and that's called the reptile brain. Theoretically, from an evolutionary point of view, the reptile brain is just primitive brain stem, keep your heart rate working, your blood pressure working. And, reptile doesn't need to do much in a sense. It'll lay an egg and walk away, versus the next level up is the mammal brain, so to speak. The mammal brain shaped like a letter C, like a Chicago Bears football helmet. That includes the cingulate gyrus, which curves around the corpus callosum, and it goes into the isthmus, and it'll come into the medial temporal lobe, which will be on the other side here. And that's a mammal brain. A mammal has limbic functions. It's also called the emotional brain. It's very fast and impulsive, but it's a powerful part of our brain. So theoretically, from an evolutionary concept, theoretically, our brain is built on the older centers, if you will. And then on top of that is the cerebral cortex, the primate brain, or really the human brain. We've got much, 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 much bigger frontal lobes than chimpanzees and other primates. And then another fascinating thing about the brain, I kind of just went through the vertical anatomy of the brain there from bottom to top. Here's the cerebellum. 70% of our brain neurons are in that cerebellum. And you're like, well, how could you fit the majority of neurons into one small little thing down here? And the reason is because they're short interneurons, and they enable you to do fine motor things. Like here, you pick up a pen. To write with a pen is really fine motor, and you need these short little correcting interneurons to be able to do that. The benefit of the supratentorial brain, the human cerebral cortex, is, and by the way, when you go from back to front, you become more abstract and more of the human qualities, the ability to delay gratification, the ability to plan for the future. And that's relevant. Like, let's say you're in a fuss with your significant other, okay? The front, you want to get yourself into an emotional mood, if you will. So you're not in a so-called amygdala hijack, if you will, of the mammal brain. And you say, well, let me think about it. Let me talk about it tomorrow. And you got to control your emotions, but you don't want to say anything to annoy your significant other, okay? So what I'm trying to say is, being aware of, am I slipping into a mammal brain emotional phase rather than a thoughtful cortical phase is important. Like if you have an important decision in your life, delay it so you're not so emotional about it, and you'll make a better decision. So I think that's relevant and useful. The other thing is Moravec's paradox. Moravec is an artificial intelligence computer programmer. And what he noted was that you could make a computer do calculus in the 1950s. They still can't make a robot move like a human because that's more difficult. It takes a lot more computing power, like from the cerebellum and whatnot, for motor movement than it does for what we would consider perhaps difficult, like calculus. So that's Moravec's paradox. Okay, so we covered the brain from top to bottom, from front to back. Basically, the more posterior you are in the brain, the more sensory it is. The more anterior, the more it is thinking. Okay, and it becomes motor right here in the middle. So basically, the sensory stuff processes information. It goes to the multimodal area between the 3 posterior lobes, and they send the message to the frontal lobes, which then make a value judgment and a decision on how to move. Okay, and that's basically how the brain works. So that was the anatomy from front to back. From side to side, we've got the right brain and the left brain. On any MRI or CAT scan, it's as if their feet are towards you. So this would be the right side over here. This would be the left side. And basically, the left brain is your classic language brain. L for language, L for linear, L for thoughtful, L for detail, versus the right brain is the more free thinking, jokes, metaphors, and whatnot, more humorous conversation. And there's overlap, of course, in language on both sides, and that's a topic for another day. It gets kind of complex, but it's interesting. Basal ganglia are the major motor centers located sort of at the lower part of the brain, and this is sort of the relay station between the primitive brain centers and the cerebral cortex up above. And this right here is like stroke land. Okay, every day I see a whole bunch of strokes in here from hypertension. Hypertension causes strokes right here. And I got a lot of neurology friends who I talk to. They'll tell you, I talk to one neurologist. I go, what's the most common cause of stroke? They go, hypertension. And that's probably the one you find in the books. I asked another one, what's the most common cause? They go, oh, it's diabetes. Diabetes patients have tons of problems. And then the third one, what's the most common cause of stroke? They go, AFib. AFib is usually a big embolic stroke, like a middle cerebral artery stroke. Hypertension stroke is usually hypertension problem right here in the basal ganglia. And diabetes is all kinds of problems, and a lot of periventricular ischemia, lack of blood flow. Okay, so here shows you like how do a lot of people become demented. This is your carotid artery coming up into the brain, internal carotid artery. It then passes to the side as the middle cerebral artery. It gives off these little branches called the lenticular striates into the basal ganglia. So this is basal ganglia level right here. The next higher level is called corona radiata at the level of the frontal horns and the lateral ventricles. Above that is the centrum semiovalle. And the reason I have a skull and crossbones here is this is the area that's most commonly has silent strokes. And the reason is, let's say you have a person who's hypertensive and they're overtreating their hypertension. Everybody's afraid of high blood pressure. Let me tell you something. Be afraid of low blood pressure, okay? Same thing with diabetes. You're afraid of high blood glucose. Be afraid of low blood glucose. Low blood glucose kills neurons. Low blood pressure kills neurons. And here's why. The blood supply has a hard time getting to this area in the middle of the brain because the lenticular striate penetrating arteries from below, it's hard for them to get up to the top. And then the penetrating arteries that come over the cerebral cortex convexities from above, they don't get to this area very well. Our brain is designed based on us eating a low-fat vegan diet where there's no atherosclerosis or hypertension. You don't have any of those things in communities that eat that way all their life. So it doesn't take a lot of disease to cause silent strokes in this area. And by the way, ask any neuroradiologist you can find, they'll all tell you the same thing. On the standard macro template for dictating a brain MRI, it always says periventricular flare hyperintensities, meaning silent strokes in that area. You'll see tons of them. I'll see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them all day long, every day. Okay, here is a picture of the side view of the brain. I only just show this because it's a trick for memorizing things. When you want to memorize something complex, you do the 6-blind man and an elephant routine of studying it rather thoroughly, and then you ask yourself a question: how will I remember this 6 months from now? And the secret to memorizing complex things that'll stick in your mind 6 months later is you say, what is a visual metaphor and a word association, but a visual metaphor I can take with me? And to memorize the lateral surface of the brain, one especially looks at the snail. The Sylvian Fisher looks like a snail. And once you found the snail, so to speak, it's easy to name every single gyrus and sulcus on the lateral convexity of the brain. The guy who figured out a lot of this is a guy named Thomas Nadich, MD. He's a neuroradiologist out in New York at Mount Sinai. The guy's a genius. He's the best neuroanatomist amongst neuroradiologists in the whole world. But the reason I show you this concept of finding a visual metaphor, I do it all the time. Like if I have to know something, I go, okay, I'm going to need to know this again in 6 months. Make a visual metaphor. You'd be amazed at how well you can memorize stuff with that. It's more powerful than word association even. They're both powerful. Okay, here's the lymphatics. No one knew that there were lymphatics in the brain until about 10 years ago. And they run parallel to the superior sagittal sinus, the big venous sinuses at the top of the brain within the dura mater. Dura means hard mater, okay? And anyways, just be aware you got lymphatics in your brain. The blue stuff is the veins, the superior sagittal sinus, for example. The yellow stuff is the cerebral spinal fluid. And you got one-way ball valves in the arachnoid villi. They reabsorb cerebral spinal fluid. It's produced down here in the choroid plexus. And this is all part of our lymphatic system. So it functions like a water helmet. You've heard of that, to protect the brain, but it also is to clean the brain. So at night, what happens is the blood-brain barrier, which tracks along these penetrating arteries, like the one I showed in that last picture, it opens up because the neurons can go offline while you're asleep, especially during deep sleep. And then what happens is the cerebral spinal fluid then leaks out and runs along the neurons and passes from the arterial perivenous space, periarterial space to the venous space. It's called the perivascular space of Virchow-Robin. And anyways, so these neurons will dump out their waste products at night. You know, again, like English Victorians dumping out their chamber pots in the street, and then it gets rinsed away by the cerebral spinal fluid, and then this tightens back up in the day because you can't run CSF over the neurons during the day when the neurons are online, or they would be non-functional. So that's called the glymphatic system, and that's why you're smartest first thing in the morning. Okay, just briefly, I'll mention something about opioids. I seen a couple strokes lately from opioids. Opioids are a disaster. In my opinion, I would never take them. Now, don't get me wrong. I realize there's special circumstances. Let's say a person has end-stage metastatic cancer. They're in terrible pain. Yeah, fine, take them, okay? But what I see in real life is a lot of people start taking opioids after a surgery, and they become addicted to them, and they often have very bad outcomes. Typically, last year, I think in 2021, about 75,000 Americans died from opioid accidental overdoses for multiple different reasons. I think that's all of them, not just accidental overdoses. And I'll just tell you, like what some of my friends do. I have a friend who is a general surgeon, does vascular surgery too. He went for open heart surgery. He should have gone low-fat vegan. That was like 25 years ago. I didn't know at the time, and neither did he. But, he just, on day one post-op, he says, I'm going home, takes his IV out and goes home. And they go, well, aren't you in pain? He's like, I can take care of that. I had an aunt who's family practice doctor. She broke her hip. She's 78 years old. Same thing. Goes home on day one of surgery. She goes, I'll take care of myself. She has her daughter that helped her. The reason I'm telling you this is the patients who have this strong determination to go home as fast as possible, they usually go home real fast versus the ones that sit there, I'm in pain. They take a bunch of opioids. They get constipated. They get an ileus where their belly puffs up and they're uncomfortable and they lay in bed. They're prone to pneumonias, pulmonary emboli. They often have poor outcomes. Okay. Maxwell Maltz was a famous surgeon who wrote about what a dramatic difference he saw in patients' outcomes just based on their attitude about the surgery and how soon they were going to go home. So here's a couple opioid strokes. So these two red circles here are strokes in a patient on opioids. And I see this too. It's boom, boom. And I see this, it's like also carbon monoxide will do that. And the relevance is as soon as I see something, these two red circles, when something's bilateral symmetric, immediately I think toxic metabolic. If it was just on one side, I'd say typical hypertension stroke. Bilateral, toxic metabolic, carbon monoxide, opioid overdose, because they're hypoxic and they sit there and they're not getting enough oxygen in their body in these hypermetabolic areas. It's called the globus pallidus, this part of the basal ganglia. It'll stroke. Hippocampuses are also very prone to strokes due to hypoxia. Hypoxia just means lack of oxygen. Okay, and then the upper part of the brain can also sometimes be stroked out with opioids, but I see it more commonly stroked out from the stuff we just talked about. So here's normal looking centrum semiovale. So it's the center of the brain. That's why it's called centrum. Semi-ovality because it's somewhat shaped like an oval. Boom, the red stuff is stroked out brain from opioid overdose. That's called heroin leukoencephalopathy. And again, most commonly I see that from hypertension and diabetes. I see tons of brain. In one day, I could see over 1,000 silent strokes. That's how common they are. Tons of people are walking around with all these silent strokes, and you don't want them. They're very common. I actually expect to see a couple of them in an American patient who's eaten a Western diet after 55. Most of them have some. Okay, and here's a couple patterns of atherosclerosis that are a little bit interesting. See how I'm doing for time. Oh, we got some time. All right. The middle cerebral artery atherosclerosis, intracranial atherosclerosis, that's especially like a Japanese or Asian pattern of atherosclerosis, intracranial atherosclerosis. Cervical carotid artery atherosclerosis and coronary artery atherosclerosis, that's especially a pattern characteristic of persons eating a high-fat diet. So why would they have different patterns of atherosclerosis? Well, here's the reason. Because a lot of the Japanese, they were smoking a lot of cigarettes and they were eating tons of sodium. They were eating, like over 10 grams a day, not uncommonly 15 grams a day. And that would crank up their blood pressure. And so they get a lot of intracranial atherosclerosis and vessel injury in their brain. They have tons of strokes. Okay, whereas a person eating the high-fat diet, the SAD diet, standard American diet, they get a lot of coronary artery disease, most common cause of death, myocardial infarction, heart attack. And they also get a good number of strokes too from these carotid plaques. But I just show you that because they're different patterns. I'm also going to show you something too. It sort of recently came up. I saw in one of the lectures there at Chef AJ's show about this lady talking about how persons of Indian descent have very common diabetes. And I'm like, oh, that sounds like BS. I don't believe it. Because I know a lot of Indian guys. They're all skinny vegetarians. I'm like, no way. Then I started reading about it. Oh my gosh, it's true. And I said, well, what could it be? And I actually think I figured it out to the best I can at this point. There's a Japanese neuroscientist by the name of Yamashima. His name is Tetsumori Yamashima. And he was studying why is there an markedly increasing rate of dementia in Japan. And he figured it out that it was due to people eating more omega-6 oils. And they were undergoing lipid peroxidation. And that was causing damage to their brain neurons because lipid peroxidation will trash a neuronal membrane. The brain's quite vulnerable to things like lipid peroxidation and oxidative stress because the brain doesn't have that much antioxidants, despite the fact it's loaded with PUFAs, and PUFAs are very vulnerable to lipid peroxidation. Okay, but anyways, getting back to this chart here, you see the Western American high-fat diet eating person, tons of myocardial infarction, a lot of impotence. The Johnson artery, pudendal artery, is only about 1.5 millimeters, so the Johnson often goes before the coronary. They're about 3 millimeters in diameter. So, the guy, by the time he wakes up, he's got a myocardial infarction and he's lost his Johnson, all right? If you look at persons of Indian descent, what gets them is they eat lots of oil. They eat tons of fried food. So even though they're largely vegetarian, they're quite often eating a lot of dairy. So they're still getting saturated fat. And that's why they have a surprisingly high incidence of diabetes. Yamashima also appears to have figured that out. I'm not 100% certain he's right. But what Yamashima claims from his research is that lipid peroxidation due to eating omega-6 oils has a tendency to damage the beta cells of the pancreas, which produce insulin. And that, he believes, is the reason for their increased risk of becoming diabetic. They're losing those beta cells that produce insulin in the pancreas. And then we talked about the Japanese sort of East Asian diet where they had real high sodium, and that was predisposing them to strokes. They had the protective effect, though, of eating tons of rice, also eating a decent amount of fruits and vegetables. And that's protected them from diabetes because they got that low-fat diet. And then look who wins the game. This is how you win the game of health. Low fat, low sodium, 100% plant-based. They don't get hardly any diabetes, hypertension, MI, stroke. Okay, it's the way to go. Okay, and like I just said, Kempner's shown it, Pritikin's shown it, McDougall's shown it, Chef AJ's shown it. Whoever studies a patient group will see. You just see from experience. This is what works. Check your cholesterol. Okay, and then people say, well, so and so maintained their A1C reasonably well on a low carb diet. Well, go ahead and do an oral glucose tolerance test on them, and you'll see that they still have insulin resistance, which means they still have dysfunctional cells throughout their body. Okay, now here's a really wonderful thing that came from a guy named Jack Delatorre. So Jack Delatorre was a researcher, and he tied off the carotid artery in a mouse. And you say, well, why would somebody do that? Well, the reason is he wanted to see what would happen to the brain, as a way to mimic carotid artery atherosclerosis. And what he found was the mouse, typically middle-aged or older mouse, would become demented 2 months after that. When he did autopsies on their brains, the mice didn't have a stroke. They just had atrophy of the same side the carotid was tied off. And he came up with the idea, well, this is due to chronic lack of blood flow, chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. And then you'll say, well, so what? I don't have a carotid atherosclerosis. It's not that common. But then you say, well, what are the mouse equivalents? And there's tons of them. Okay. Atrial fibrillation. You have discoordinated contraction of the atria of your heart, drops your cardiac output, let's say as much as 25% less atrial filling. Chronic hypoperfusion of the brain. When you get a stroke, a bunch of brain cells die all at once. I can point right to the spot on a brain MRI. That's where the stroke is. I can tell you what gyrus it's in because the plasma membrane lyses, all the contents of the neurons spill out into the extracellular matrix. There's a big inflammatory response to it. But it's not like that with slow brain cell death. Slow brain cell death means you just chronically deprive them of oxygen or glucose, and the brain cells die slowly. They can't meet their metabolic demand, so they recycle themselves. It's a way that the brain saves the molecules in that area. But all these things do it. AFib, congestive heart failure, chronic hypoperfusion of the brain. It's a mouse equivalent. Obstructive sleep apnea. You put a pulse ox on them, they're dropping their sats at night. That's chronic hypoxia. They're losing brain cells. Hypoglycemia, a lot of diabetics, they stick their finger about 3 times a day. They didn't know what their sugars are at night, but it turns out they're dropping their blood glucose quite often dramatically. Now you can put a CGM on them, continuous glucose monitor at night, and they're becoming demented. And I can't tell you, the majority of diabetics I talk to over 50 years old are cognitively impaired. They're very mentally slow. They lack insight into their condition. And a lot of times, they might have had it for a while. They think they're okay, treating it with a medication, but they're not doing anything to improve their diet. And they have very poor outcomes. It's just good to be aware of that because a lot of people who don't really understand the pathophysiology, they go, oh, it's under control. It's under control. Actually, it's probably not. Overtreated hypertension. Like I said, you bring that pressure down too low, you're going to run the risk of not getting enough blood to those brain cells. The reason the pressure was higher was probably to get adequate blood to your brain cells. So you have to decide what's your therapeutic goal with hypertension. I don't personally treat hypertension. I'm primarily a neuroradiologist, but man, I looked at tons of brains, and I'm telling you, hypertension is the most common risk of all these silent strokes. McDougall, usually, I think I've heard him say he likes to go by 150 repeated outpatient systolic blood pressure as an indication whether or not he'll treat with a medication. Other people might use a lower threshold, 140 or something. That would be something you'd have to work out with your own physician. Carotid stenosis, we talked about that. Atherosclerosis in the carotid artery. Aortic stenosis or regurg, mouse equivalent. Post-cabbage hypotension, mouse equivalent. I was with my dad in the operating room post-op when he went for a cabbage back in the days. We didn't know any better, and I tried to tell him to take the Ornish diet, but I didn't come down strong enough. It was many, many years ago, like over 20 years ago, and they ran him hypotensive post-op because I asked the anesthesiologist, why are you doing that? I slept with him in his room all the time. He's in the hospital in the ICU. And they said, oh, it's because we don't want him to bleed out of his anastomosis where the arteries were connected. Well, that puts you at risk to unperfuse your brain. He did okay with that, but he actually, when they stapled down the lumen to the LAD, left internal mammary artery to the left anterior descending coronary artery, simple thing done in a cabbage. He ended up having a stroke 4 years later, shoveling snow. And I think it's because his lima was stapled, making it less able to move while he throws snow over his shoulder. So that was real sad. He had to retire at that point. He was about 74 at that time. Okay, things that increase demand. This is what I was getting at. Well, if you got decreased perfusion and you combine that with something ramping up the metabolic rate in that neuron, like stress, caffeine, and these other things we talked about, And then you also add some mitochondrial inhibitors, like a lot of these toxic food stuffs we'll talk about later, and we'll talk about some more. You can see you're screwing that neuron. You're dropping the blood supply, simultaneously ramping up the metabolic demand. And how is that blood supply? They have to match each other. They have to be equal. So if metabolic demand's up here and blood supply is down here, that neuron's at very high risk of going to apoptosis, which means die. Okay, let's see here. So the main issue causing brain cells to die is all the, yeah, the amyloid cascade. You know, it's worth knowing it exists, and there's a few other things. Aluminum, I do think, is neurotoxic. And by the way, they put aluminum in water because it clarifies it. So, you know, check your water, know how much there's in there. If there's a high aluminum in your water, you're at increased risk for dementia. That's also why I won't eat anything out of a can. If I have a choice, I won't eat anything out of a can because aluminum. And then they typically will have a BPA lining, but there's tears in the BPA lining. So you'll have that typically in that bottle. And that was in the baby foods. You know, be an aluminum can with a BPA lining, et cetera, other problems too. I was amazed at how many problems are with a lot of these baby foods. McDougall has a newsletter on, you know, the type that he recommends. But just be careful about that. Don't just assume, you know, if you get baby food that it's actually okay. You know, poor kid starts off with that, you know, disadvantage problem. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, here's another thing I want to show you about normal variance. So there's a lot of variation in human anatomy, and I look at these cerebral arteriograms every day. And so here's a typical looking set of arteries in the brain. This is the internal carotid artery coming up into the brain, and here's the posterior communicating artery, which will connect to the posterior cerebral artery. So communicator connects one site to another, and it'll typically be a small artery. In a developing person, you know, in the early phases of life, it's actually a big artery that then shrinks down, and the basilar artery right here at the base of the brain, basilar for base of the brain, gets quite big. So what I'm trying to say is a normal variation. Some people have big PCOMs, posterior communicating arteries, and they'll get compensatory hypoplasia, small shrunk basilar. So some people got a really small basilar artery. That ends up being a big deal. And I'll show you why it's a big deal. Because that's supplying your brainstem. And when an artery is small, it's more vulnerable to getting atherosclerosis along its wall. That's called mural atherosclerosis. And people can stroke out their brainstem pretty easily. So here's a brainstem with the basilar artery running on top of it. These are the vertebral arteries feeding into it. So when you've got bilateral persistent fetals leading to a hypoplastic small basilar artery, a little bit of atherosclerosis in here, and you'll stroke out your brainstem, stroke out your cerebellum. So here's a paper writing about this bilateral vertebral artery hypoplasia and fetal type variants, association with posterior cerebral artery and acute stroke. Okay, so here's what I see. I see these kinds of things. I mean, this isn't the most common form of stroke. The reason I'm showing it to you, though, is because you don't know if you have this. Any one of us could have this. And the only way you know is if you image it. Now, I'm not saying go image it because there's equivalent things like this all over the body. But what I'm trying to say is the smart move is assume that you have this and live your life accordingly. So here's bilateral persistent fetal PCOM. The big honking PCOMs feeding into the posterior cerebral arteries. And so this patient has, you can't even see the basilar artery in here. It's still hypoplastic. So here's their strokes. Pop, pop. All these little bright spots are strokes. Pop, 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 pop. You know, that's how easy it is to stroke out your brainstem and your cerebellum. If you got a hypoplastic basilar, you're predisposed to stroke. It doesn't take a lot, because most people will say stuff to me. Well, you know, I have a cousin, and he, like my uncle, he lived to 95 and he ate a lot of meat. He smoked cigarettes or something. And what I'm saying is, don't assume you'll be as lucky as that other person. You have to kind of look at the law of averages, if you will. And a wise move is to say, well, you might have persistent PCOMs. You might have similar arterial anatomy in other parts of your body, including your heart, other parts of your brain, and just optimize things. So just in case you're in good shape. And you can't go imaging all these. There's too many of them, and we can't even see a bunch of them probably. I'm showing you the metaphor of a big common one, but they exist all over the place. Here's one in the heart. Here's a ramus intermedius. And that is, instead of having a bifurcation, typical coronary artery anatomy is left main coronary artery bifurcates into left anterior descending, LAD, and the circumflex goes around the side of the heart. Coronaries, because they're called coronaries because they're like a crown. Anyways, you can sometimes have a third branch right here called the ramus intermedius. Well, the point is, the bigger the artery, the easier it is to stent it, the easier it is to bypass it. When you've got a trifurcation instead of a bifurcation, it's going to be harder to stent that. It's going to be harder to bypass that. And they're predisposed to more atherosclerosis. And again, I'm saying, you don't know what you got. And I personally don't think you need to image your coronaries unless you have some special, you're symptomatic or your physician tells you to. The reason I'm saying that is, just assume you've got atherosclerosis if you've eaten a high-fat diet earlier in your life. Just assume you got it and stop doing that, okay? That I think is a smart thing, because if you go, like say you get a coronary calcium test, it's going to show you a bunch of calcium. What good does that do you? I told you already, if you've eaten a high-fat diet, you know you have it. When you feed a herbivore a high-fat diet, they all get atherosclerosis. So you can guarantee you have it. So why give yourself the radiation? That would be my feeling, unless your doctor specifically recommends it. Okay, so here's an article about culprit lesions in the LAD, left anterior descending, in patients with a ramus intermedius, okay? And they've got more problems. Here's another thing. I see this every day. Here's a patient's cervical spine. This is the vertebrae of the spine. Here's the skull base. Here's the occipital bone. Here's the C2 vertebra on the spine. And the reason I'm showing you this is some people have a congenitally narrow cervical spinal canal. And typically the reason people get problems with their spine is because of atherosclerosis. Most people aren't aware of this. Trust me, I've written books on this subject as well. When you decrease the blood supply to the spine, the disc will degenerate. A disc is alive. It runs on anaerobic glycolysis with glucose, okay? When it becomes ischemic, lacking blood supply, it will crack on its outer surface, the annulus fibrosus. It'll leak nucleus pulposus, the thin jelly donut stuff posteriorly. In addition, it won't be able to support weight, so the bones will get larger. They'll have bone spurs called osteophytes to support more weight. And what happens is the spinal cord can be compressed. And what I'm getting at here is some people got a narrow spinal canal. A little tiny disc bulge or bone spur will compress their cord. Then they got to go for surgery of their spine. And it's just bad luck. Some people have that. Again, the human body is designed that a person eats low-fat vegan their whole life. Or not low-fat vegan, low-fat, almost completely vegan is sort of, I think, what we're designed for. I know, but it's smarter, like I said, to be vegan. But the reason I'm telling you that is assume you got it, because you can end up with cord compression with not a lot of atherosclerotic degenerative disc disease. And it's no fun, having somebody open up your neck and operate on you. Okay. Like I said, either go low fat vegan or you're pretty much stuck. You're probably going to get drugged and surgerized. That's the way it goes. Because I mean, that's basically your option. I've been studying this for a lot of years. I've been a doctor for 30 years, and I can tell you, you either optimize your health or you're going to get drugged and surgerized. It's just the way, it's what it comes down to. Okay, here's the anatomy of a neuron. Okay, these are your brain cells that fire action potentials to communicate with each other. So this part is called the cell body. This is where the nucleus is. And sometimes this part's also called the soma. These are the dendrites. They receive sensory information from above. When the neuron is activated, it'll fire an action potential beginning at the axon hillock. It'll travel down the neuron to the axon terminal. At the axon terminal, then, the neurotransmitter is stored. This will cause a neurotransmitter to be sent down to the synapse. It'll fuse with the synaptic membrane, release its neurotransmitter across the synapse, and it'll then communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. This right here is called the synaptic cleft, and it'll activate this neuron to do something. That's normal neuronal transmission. This is myelin, the fat around neurons, and that's a normal thing in the brain that actually speeds up conduction. It's like the insulation around an electrical wire. Okay, now here, for example, is a dopamine neuron. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and again, this will be the presynaptic junction. I just drew this up here showing that when a neuron is depolarized, normally a neuron has a negative charge inside, about negative 65 millivolts. During depolarization, when the sodium comes in, it becomes positively charged inside. That activates the calcium channel, voltage-gated calcium channel, to let calcium come into the neuron. The elevated calcium in the cytoplasm of the axon terminal causes the neurotransmitter to be released. Neurotransmitter diffuses across the cleft. It binds with the postsynaptic receptor. So DAR is dopamine receptor, DA for dopamine, R for receptor, and then it will cause a secondary effect on the postsynaptic neuron. And the relevance of this is whenever you give a medication that affects a neurotransmitter, the brain does not just accept that effect. It sees that as a problem and it tries to compensate for that. So for example, if you give a medication here, a neuroleptic that's going to block these dopamine receptors, you'll get compensatory placement of more receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. So let's say this one has 2 per given area. This one will now have, let's say I've drawn 5 here. So there's always going to be a change in the synapse if you try to change what it's doing. It sort of knows what it's supposed to do. And that's an important point, because people try to think that the brain is real simple and you can just, I'm just going to change dopamine. I'm just going to change serotonin. It's not that easy. It'll actually turn out, and I had a beautiful drawing, which my computer crashed. There was like an electrical storm where I was, and so I had to redo all these slides. And what I'm trying to say here is these neurons all work together like an orchestra. And dopamine is a modulator of glutamate transmission, as is serotonin. And you can't, and Dr. Klaper had a real nice lecture. I think he was talking about leaky gut. Remember, anybody see that lecture? He goes, you can't do one thing. And Klaper is right. Whatever you change one thing in the brain, there will be all these compensatory changes. So what I'm trying to say is Don't think that it's easy to change something in your brain. Don't think it's simple. For example, here's a serotonin synapse. And it's serotonin synapse. By the way, tryptophan is made into serotonin. And then the neurotransmitter, it fuses with the plasma membrane of the synaptic cleft, diffuses across the synaptic cleft, binds with the postsynaptic receptor, and then it's taken up and back into the presynaptic neuron. It has to be taken up quickly out of the synapse in order for neurons to fire on and off quickly. So this would be the serotonin reuptake transport. It's usually called the SERT, S-E-R-T. Okay, and then here's an SSRI, for example, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor, which will inhibit that. It'll block this reuptake so that there'll be more serotonin in the cleft. And those are typically called antidepressants, for example. Here's another thing very important on brain cells, on your neurons. It's important in every cell of your body, but especially in neurons. Typical resting membrane potential in a neuron is about -65 millivolts. And that is, there's leaky potassium channels that help set this, but it's really maintained by the potassium, sodium ATPase. K is for kalium and N for natrium. That's sort of the Latin words for potassium and sodium. So 2 potassium are pumped in. What am I doing for time? I still got some time. All right, 2 potassium are pumped in, 3 Na plus are pumped out. And this is thus pumping out 3 positive charges for 2 coming in, and that helps keep it negatively charged inside the neuron. And you now have established a gradient where there's a lot of sodium outside, not much inside the cell. And this gradient, both an electrical gradient because of the charge and a concentration gradient because there's more sodium outside, it's an electrochemical gradient, is then coupled to other things, most importantly, to pump calcium outside of a cell. And what I'm showing you here is one of the great secrets of health, okay? Trust me, this is why sodium is such a big deal and why I'm a big believer in keep your sodium kind of low. Kempner was a genius, okay? He knew what he was doing. He thought it was a good idea to keep sodium low. Now, you don't need to keep it as low as Kempner did. He was obsessive compulsive and he was taking care of super sick patients, that would be in an ICU. But for a regular person, a little bit of sodium is okay. But what I'm trying to just let you know here, there's a good reason why you don't want excessive dietary sodium, all right? Because it's going to dissipate this gradient, lead to more intercellular sodium, and it's going to make you less able to run your knockout exchanger, sodium calcium exchanger, to pump calcium out of your neurons. Okay. In addition, you're not only going to get calcium accumulating in the cytoplasm of your neurons, it's going to accumulate in your smooth muscle cells along your small arteries, and they're going to be constricted because calcium is like an on switch in the body. It'll make neurons fire, and it'll also make smooth muscle cells contract. So you're going to have a higher contraction of all the small arteries in your body with excessive dietary sodium because it's going to lead to increased cytoplasm calcium. In addition, sodium also inhibits nitric oxide of your endothelial cells, the lining cells of your arteries, and nitric oxide is the vasodilator. So it also causes problems in that sense. The other thing too, Kempner was a brilliant guy. He'd been a kidney researcher, and he was also aware that elevated excessive dietary sodium causes an increase in sympathetic tone, meaning the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, which is part of your stress response, meaning increased catecholamines, things like epinephrine, norepinephrine. Those are the same as adrenaline and noradrenaline. So the point is, it'll predispose to hypertension. Those also cause an increase in blood glucose, and they cause a bit of insulin resistance. So it's working against you to have excessive dietary sodium. And then also another thing that comes up that Kempner had mentioned was when people reduce dietary sodium, let's say from 10 grams a day to 3 grams per day, they get some improvement, a small improvement in their hypertension, but not that much. However, when you start taking the sodium down from 3 grams a day down to, let's say, about 500 milligrams a day, then you see a big benefit. It's sort of a threshold effect. And so that's an important thing to realize, because you'll hear some people say, oh, whoop-de-doo, so-and-so reduced their dietary sodium from 6 grams a day to 3 grams a day, and they only had, 5 units of a decrease in their systolic pressure. Well, if they went down a little lower, they might get a bigger decrease. And they're also going to be improving these other things I spoke about. Every cell in their body will function better. We're designed to eat high potassium and low sodium. There's no animal that eats higher sodium than potassium. Okay, plants have tons of potassium, which is good. In addition, take a look at this right here. Here's your magnesium. Magnesium is coupled to your ATP because the phosphates have a strong negative charge on them, which repels each other. That's why you get so much energy when you take a phosphate off an ATP, is because all those negative charges are happy to move away from each other. And the point is that magnesium is a bridging molecule with 2 positive charges to hold those phosphates together onto ATP. And what are the most common dietary deficiencies in a Western standard American diet? Low potassium, because it comes from plants. Low magnesium, because it comes from plants. Magnesium is located in the center of chlorophyll. And also low fiber. Those are the 3 most common dietary deficiencies. And you can see you're messing up your sodium potassium neuron membrane pumps. And these pumps are in every cell in your body because they're used all over the place to be coupled to other ion transports. It's an important thing. And also, where am I coming from that you might find happy? I'm not just trying to survive. I want to be as healthy as I could be. I want to be as smart as I could be. I want to avoid dementia. And I believe it's good to try to seek what is the best you could do. Because if you try to be the best you could be in terms of your health and whatnot, your cognitive function, then you're going to do as well as you can. Versus a lot of people that kind of go, half butt on it. And they're like, well, I'm doing okay. Well, a lot of these doing okay, they drop into diabetes, coronary artery disease, strokes and stuff, and they often don't do so well. Cancer. So I think it's worth it to try to optimize things. All right, now here's a little more complex neuron. And this is just showing a glutamate synapse. Glutamate's about 80% of the neurotransmitters in your brain. And we showed, the calcium knockout exchanger right here from the sodium. We showed the K and ATP is on the previous neuron. We talked about arresting membrane potential, negative 65 millivolts. There's another slower pump to pump calcium out. That's ATP dependent though. So anyways, when glutamate is released across the synapse, it will bind to the AMPA receptors. Right here is AMPA-R receptor. Then sodium comes into the cell, depolarizes. That means it makes positive charge in the postsynaptic neuron. And then that will cause the magnesium to jump out of the NMDA receptor, which is also for glutamate. And that will then allow calcium to come into the cell and activate the postsynaptic neuron. The reason I'm showing you this is when this becomes excessive, this is one of the most common causes of brain cell death. Okay, there's a lot of interesting little things on this picture. I had a fancier picture, but I wasn't able to get it for today. I'll get it next time I'm around. Anyways, here's glycine. Glycine can also bind to this, and this is why I don't like glyphosate, because glyphosate is basically very similar to glycine with just a few other molecules attached to its tail, if you will, and it is thought that it can potentially interact with this NMDA receptor. It's also thought that beta amyloid precipitates, oligomers, can bump into the NMDA receptor and open it up unwanted. Stress causes increased glutamate going across this neurotransmitter. Sleep deprivation, glucocorticoid medication, they're all increasing this glutamate transmission across here. And so you can overactivate this postsynaptic neuron. When you get too much calcium in here, it can do a lot of things you don't want. It can activate a calpain protease. Look at the name of this enzyme, cal as in calcium, pain as in painful, and it'll damage things. It can damage the knockout exchanger. And so excessive calcium entering the postsynaptic neuron is a very common cause of neuronal cell death. And this is why I recommend no caffeine, because I want to minimize my glutamate. I don't want any excessive glutamate going across my synapse, okay? I think you become resilient. One of the things you notice, like ever hang around an emergency room, you'll see the best emergency room doctors, they're real cool and collected. They walk into the room, the patient's having a disaster, they manage it, they don't get excited at all, they go in the next room, they manage it, and they stay cool. The reason is you got to stay cool, calm and collected to be able to think well. And if you get all emotional, you can't do so well. So what I'm trying to say is by lowering your sort of agitation level, this is also why I think food has a tremendous effect on mood. You decrease your risk of being anxious by not having excessive glutamate transmission. And also the same thing, your catecholamines, your stress response makes you less able to sleep, more prone to insomnia. It makes you more resilient, more healthy. Okay. And there's other things that'll happen. Excessive dietary calcium, it's going to injure the mitochondria down here. It's going to activate all these other pathways. It really doesn't matter all the things that it does. And believe me, there's like 10 different things that it does. The key thing is anything that's either going to increase calcium in the cytoplasm of a cell, or that's going to decrease the cell's ability to make ATP, is going to decrease the likelihood that neuron's going to survive. So good blood flow, avoiding mitochondrial toxins, avoiding stress equivalents, avoiding mouse equivalents, all of those give you the healthiest possible brain. I had a friend, a lady neuroradiologist who worked in Chinatown area. And she told me she see all these old Chinese people when they get a brain CT, their brain, she said, looked incredibly young, quite a dramatic lack of atrophy. And those are the ones eating the old-fashioned rice-based diet. Okay, here's a couple things about food and mood. Of course, sleep is important. We talked about that. High-fat diet is bad for multiple reasons. Number one, it causes Rouleau formation, sticking the RBCs together, dropping oxygen delivery. And you've seen, you can look at the video, Dr. McDougall, it's a high-fat diet, blood sludge, you'll see it. It's only 50 seconds long. Trust me, it's worth seeing that. It's not why you feel sluggish after a greasy spoon. You got Rouleau formation, sticking your RBCs together, dropping your oxygen delivery to the tissues. There's lots of other problems. Omega-6 oils causing lipid peroxidation, damaging plasma membranes. Sodium, excessive dietary sodium causing vasoconstriction, inhibiting nitric oxide, interfering with your ion pumps. Lack of magnesium and potassium are both vasodilators. You want them, okay? Excessive stress. So all those things are decreasing blood supply to your brain cells. And so what I'm saying is A lot of times when a person's sad or depressed or anxious, first thing they should do is say, are my health habits as good as possible? And a lot of times people do have dramatic, sad things in their life. Everybody has that. But you'll be more resilient if you optimize all this dietary stuff and you avoid toxic stuff. And not guarantee that'll resolve your problems, but that's a big step in a positive direction. Like I said, I recommend avoiding these stimulants. I think they're much more harmful than is widely recognized. This is just the higher your LDL cholesterol, the more your red blood cells are stuck together, the higher blood viscosity, which means the more prothrombotic it is. LDL is a bridging molecule, meaning that it sticks red blood cells together. Red blood cells have a negative charge on their outer surface called the zeta potential. It's due to sialic acid residues in the glycocalyx. And I know I just said a bunch of fancy words there. The bottom line is they've got a negative charge on their outer surface, your red blood cells, called a zeta potential. Now, blood banks need to know about this. The doctors don't know this. I've never met a doctor who knows this. And I get residents and medical students that come by and I teach them once in a while and I give lectures once in a while. And I can tell you, I've never met anybody who knows this. All right. And it's a really useful thing to know. So they got negative charges on the outer surface, the RBCs to repel each other. When you get a bridging molecule in there, like LDL cholesterol, that's why cholesterol is the main risk factor for atherosclerosis, because it sticks red blood cells together. And atherosclerosis is a clot, okay? It starts out as a clot. I did a fellowship, just so you know, in vascular interventional radiology, imaging guided surgery, with the emphasis on vascular disease, okay? I've been interested in this for decades, and trust me, atherosclerosis starts out as a blood clot. That's important to know. You can't make sense of it until you understand that. And these are just bridging molecules. IgM antibodies with acute infection, you're more prone to clotting. Fibrinogen with stress or other reasons, you're more prone to clotting. That's an acute phase reactant, meaning the liver releases it during inflammation. So inflammation makes you more prone to clotting. That's why you want to decrease inflammation in your body. What causes tons of inflammation? Eating meat. Why? Because it causes leaky gut, number one. It also causes xenocellulitis, number two, and it causes a whole bunch of other problems. Uric acid can also function as a bridging molecule, and that could be elevated when a person has dramatically high amounts of like industrial fructose, let's say a fructose sweetened beverage. That's a whole other story. I don't want to go into all that right now. Here's the Rouleau formation, RBC stuck together by the bridging molecule, in particular LDL cholesterol, disrupts flow patterns that makes it atherogenic, more prothrombotic. Other things about emotion and mood. Oh, different theories of depression. Depression is obviously multifactorial. The reason I kind of got into this stuff is I was reviewing all my causes of dementia. I was curious to check the psychiatry literature. I was most interested in the neuropsychopharmacology literature. And I saw all these different theories for depression. And of course, it's multifactorial. Sad events in a person's life can make somebody depressed. That's very understandable. But if they're also eating a diet that's, causing excessive activity in their hippocampus, that makes it worse. There's different theories. We don't really need to go into all this right now, but food has a big effect on mood. Okay, so the first thing you could fix if your mood's not what you want it to be, make sure you've optimized all the stuff we talked about. Optimize your diet and avoid the toxins and avoid the excitotoxins, the things that overstimulate your neurons. CRP is a blood test, and everybody says it's inflammation. It's really also a marker of a high-fat meal. The muscles can't replace, their glycogen in the setting of high fat because they're not getting enough glucose delivery and they're insulin resistant. And so they release myokines that elevate CRP. That's an important to know, just because people think CRP is like the end all be all of inflammation, and it's not. It's also a signaling molecule for glycogen depletion in skeletal muscle. Let's see. Some of this is a repeat. Oh, inflammatory theories of depression. Well, I found this a little bit funny because now as it's been seen that the antidepressants, conventional stuff, hasn't worked as well as was hoped. There's this idea that, well, maybe depression is primarily inflammatory. And so what I'm trying to say is, well, what's the best thing to do to reduce inflammation? Eat low-fat vegan, avoid the meat, the oils, and the processed food with all the chemicals in there. So there is a big effect of this stuff on mood. And I noticed a change in my personality too. I kind of calmed down. And one of the things I calmed down from being a young guy to being an old guy is I realized, you really can't change the world too much. The best thing you can do is try to lead by example, if you will, because most people, it's hard enough to change yourself. It's really hard to change anybody else. And I stopped thinking I could change anything in a sense. I just tried to be my best self, if you will. And I know that going vegan, well, first of all, going vegetarian, I noticed that things didn't bother me as much. And then when I went vegan, things got even better. And when I quit the caffeine, I slept better. Okay, now here's a slide that I think is really cool. Okay, we only got about 20 minutes, but this is a cool slide. All right, because I'm showing you here something here, and I guarantee you won't know it. You could talk to most neurologists won't know what I'm showing you, and this is one of the great secrets of the brain. Everybody's heard, well, the brain runs on glucose, the brain needs glucose, the brain just takes glucose as much as it wants. Well, it's not that simple. You got glucose type 1 transporters. They don't need any insulin to transport glucose across the blood-brain barrier. These little like hexagons here are glucose molecules. they'll go across the blood-brain barrier, and now they're going to head towards the neuron. And the neuron does have a lot of glucose type 3 transporters, so GLUT3s. Okay, that's all wonderful, and that's what you can find pretty fast. But here's the secret that people don't know, and this is important. You also have a lot of GLUT4s on your hippocampal neurons and in a lot of other neurons in your brain, including your substantia nigra, the area that's damaged with Parkinson's disease, and some of your cerebral cortex. Okay, and the reason this is a big deal is these are insulin dependent. When you have insulin resistance, you are impairing the ability of these neurons to take up glucose. So this is what I'm trying to say. When you have diabetes, you don't just have a little minor issue with your blood sugar. You have impaired function of your brain cells. You deprive these neurons of glucose while you simultaneously ramp up their activity, drinking caffeine, MSG, being stressed for unnecessary things or whatever it might be, and then you're ingesting mitochondrial toxins, whatever they might be. I've got lists of them elsewhere, but you get my point. You're screwing the neuron because you're ramping up its metabolic demand while you're depleting its glucose supply, and then you got all this atherosclerosis, high-fat diet. You're dropping its blood supply, its oxygen delivery. It can't meet its oxygen demand. So it's let's say its metabolic demand's up here, its oxygen glucose delivery's down here. The neuron just goes, can't do it, time to die, time to recycle, because it happens gradually. The neuron will recycle itself through apoptosis. And in my experience of having studied the brain for many years, and I review thousands of brains, okay, and I teach other doctors about brains, okay, I've been doing this for many years, and I look at all the complicated, weird cases of dementia. I can tell you that is what I think is the most common cause: the dilatory concept of chronic cerebral hypoperfusion and the secondary concept of excitotoxicity. And I think other things contribute. You're going to hear about aluminum contributing. You're going to hear about other things. There are other things that contribute. Medication side effects contribute, okay? In fact, a lot of the psychiatric meds, a lot of them in the long term cause cognitive impairment. In the short term, maybe they'll give some therapeutic effect that one wants, but watch out for them long term. You'd be amazed. I think every single category that I reviewed, all the major categories, have on a long-term basis a significant tendency towards cognitive impairment. So we talked about the brain. It needs tons of glucose. It cannot run on fat. It simply is not designed to run on fat. There's a great paucity of fat processing enzymes, let's say for beta oxidation in your brain mitochondria. It wants to burn glucose. And I think that's because when fats get into the mitochondria, they cause more trouble, more reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress, more likely to cause brain damage. The blood-brain barrier is also impaired by excessive psychological stress, so caffeine would contribute to that. In addition, saturated fat impairs blood-brain barrier permeability and potentially some of these other fats like lipid peroxidation. So that means you can disrupt the ionic milieu to a small extent, and you're just making stuff worse. There's even something called the lipid invasion theory of cognitive decline. There's a really good paper on that. And so you don't want to mess with that. This just shows the glucose is a carbohydrate. So carbon that's hydrated, H2O on every single carbon. You just flip one of these H's up to here, and you got H2O on every carbon. So it's already largely oxidized. Look at a fat. Look at the fatty acid tail. All these hydrocarbons. There's no oxygen on these. So it takes a lot more oxygen to metabolize a fat. That might be good down in your belly, as a good form of stored energy because you store it dry, but it's not so good in the brain. Okay, here's a PUFA, a polyunsaturated fatty acid. So what it means with a PUFA is you've got a double bond, two double bonds. Poly means more than one double bond. And in between, you got a methylene bridge carbon. So that hydrogen hanging on the methylene bridge carbon has its electrons being pulled on by these double bonds. And the effect of the double bonds adjacent to it is that hydrogen can easily be plucked off. And when it's plucked off, that's what lipid peroxidation is all about. The hydrogen between the double bonds called the methylene bridge hydrogen, carbon, and that hydrogen gets plucked off and you end up with a free radical, electron in the outer orbital that's unpaired. Makes it highly reactive. Oxygen will combine with this, and then you form a peroxy radical, meaning two oxygens next to each other. So the point is, PUFAs are very prone to this. This is another reason why I'm not a big fan on this idea of omega-3 supplementation, because those things got tons of double bonds on them, like 5 or 6 double bonds. They are super vulnerable to this lipid peroxidation stuff. It's big enough, your ALA and LA precursors that you get from plants, plenty from plants, and I'd recommend going with that because I worry about lipid peroxidation. Yamashima found that he did his work with omega-6 oils, not with omega-3s, but I haven't studied omega-3 specifically for brain lipid peroxidation, but I would be worried about it. Based on what I know, I would think that that's potentially a significant problem. We talked about how the brain does not like to burn fats. Oh, and what was I getting at? This idea of you could eat a giant meal, all right? But if you've got insulin resistance, you are not going to get enough glucose into those neurons with the GLUT4 transporters, which are located in your hippocampus memory center. They're located in your substantia nigra. okay, of your midbrain, okay, which is vulnerable for Parkinson's disease. So those neurons are starving in the midst of plenty due to insulin resistance from the high fat, all right? Primarily from high fat, this is the main cause of insulin resistance, main cause of diabetes type 2. So you get that starving in the midst of plenty, that neuron is screwed, all right? So what I'm trying to do here, the reason why I think this should be helpful to persons is recognizing these are the things that kill brain cells, the same things that cause atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes. And you can avoid that. And the same thing also that inhibit mitochondrial function. Here's another thing hardly anybody knows about. These are called SERCA, sarcoplasm endoplasmic reticulum ATPase inhibitors. And what this is all about is the endoplasmic reticulum in brain cells. Sarcoplasm is just in muscle cells, but they call the ATPase SERCA. Excuse me. There's a whole bunch of things that inhibit, like processed food. Red number 3 has been shown to inhibit SERCA. Food preservatives, BHT, BHA, TBHQ, inhibit SERCA. Okay, aluminum, but it can potentially inhibit SERCA. Cadmium, diabetes, MJ will do it. Some of these cleaning chemicals do it, paint, adhesive, glues, a lot of these volatile organic compounds. So what I'm trying to say is all these things, basically a good rule of thumb is if it smells bad, it's bad for you. You know, God gave us a nose for good reason. When a truck drives past me on the street, I will hold my breath till it's as far away gone as possible. You don't want to breathe diesel fuel. You don't want to breathe car exhaust. You don't want to breathe stuff you don't have to. If you have to work with cleaning chemicals, open the door, okay? I see a lot of people will have all these cleaning chemicals right in their face. They don't even open the door, okay? These things are neurotoxic, all right? And look at this, processed food. It's really bad, much worse than people realize. I've read entire books about the biochemistry of processed food, things that you don't want. Believe me, it's worse than you think. Here's just some references on that stuff. Other things that improve your mood. Yeah, exercise improves your self-esteem. All kinds of good things come from exercise. We know that. Sunshine improves your mood. You get more activated vitamin D, the one you want, not just the one you measure in the blood. Optimal diet. You also get vasodilators, more nitric oxide. Social support, you know, try to have good relationships, get along with people. Religion helps some people. If that helps you, that's great. A lot of healthy people like Seventh-day Adventists, that's been good for them. Sense of autonomy, that gets into the philosophy of what you want to do with your life. Having a purpose in your life, helping other people, all these things kind of make you happier. And there was a good quote, this guy is sort of a famous psychiatrist, Thomas Szasz, he says, and you know, Viktor Frankl said the same thing, Dostoevsky said the same thing, having a sense of meaning and purpose in your life, it energizes you. And that's why you want to spend some time figuring out your personal philosophy. What would energize me, would make me excited to get out of bed in the morning, because that will often help you to live a happier, better life. Okay, attention deficit. I reviewed the attention deficit when I was studying the pharmacology of synapses, and the impression I got was these stimulants, they changed the postsynaptic receptor, the presynaptic neuron, and you know, you can have a short-term effect on somebody, but in the long term, they all tend to change the brain, and it eventually can potentially become reversible. And the long-term effects, in my opinion, from studying it from a couple of different sources, I thought were rather poor. So I was not impressed with the long-term results on that sort of stuff. Same thing with schizophrenia. I was more impressed by Soteria than I was with the neuroleptics. Okay, here's another concept that's kind of interesting. Here's a concept of prions. This is now the beta amyloid stuff. Okay, first of all, this is the beta amyloid protein in your brain. It's an alpha helix, meaning it's curled like a cylinder. And there's hydrogen bonding in between the same molecule that keeps it coiled like a cylinder. And the way this becomes relevant is this comes from the work of Douglas Kell and Astheresia Pretorius. Ooh, we're almost running out of time here. I can't count my slides in here. I don't think I got that much left. So anyways, leaky gut allows bacteria to get into your blood, as well as bacterial endotoxin, LPS. And that will cause liver to release fibrinogen, the acute phase reactant with inflammation. And that can make your blood more prothrombotic. And then the big catch is as people get older, they become iron overloaded. And the iron here, I'm gonna show you a better picture in a moment, but this iron contributes to the formation of reactive oxygens. It can ferrous redox cycle between Fe2 plus and Fe3 plus. All of these things make the blood more prone to clotting, and the high fat diet can cause blood-brain barrier increased permeability. And this can lead to an effect on the beta amyloid proteins in the brain, making them come together. And they switch from being shaped like a helix to being flat like a sheet. It's called beta pleated sheets, and it will stack up upon each other. And the hydrogen bonds will change from being intramolecular within the same molecule to being inter between molecules. And you form these big stack, initially oligomers, which will then push on the postsynaptic membrane and can activate NMD receptors to let more calcium into cells. And they can even, by their physical mass, as they get bigger and bigger, push on adjacent neurons. And this is thought to be the mechanism by which prions, meaning a protein, can propagate a damaging effect. So that what I just told you is actually a fascinating thing. Most doctors don't know it, and it's interesting. Prions themselves, through aggregation and enlargement and precipitation, can push on synapses and change the NMDA receptor to cause excitotoxicity. Plus, they can cause precipitation of other beta amyloid protein in an adjacent neuron. So that may not sound like a big deal, but trust me, that's a fascinating thing. How can a prion all by itself propagate itself through the brain and damage neurons? And that's the mechanism right there. Alpha helix transformation into beta pleated sheet. Okay, so this is another reason why you don't want leaky gut. What causes that? There's a whole bunch of things that cause it. We know vegetable oils do, we know meat does, and there's other things. There's a whole list of things that do it, but those are the big ones. Dormant bacteria in the blood, interesting thing, and trust me, it's true. It's a long story, but we don't got time for that, but that's true. Free iron, and you get more iron overloaded as you get older. This is just the way it's described. To see it in a book or paper. PRPC, normal protein. PRSC, it should be an SC, because sheep, which they get so much itching, they would scrape their belly on the ground. That's how it got called scabies in sheep. The prion form Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, which is also mad cow disease. Mad cow is also usually called BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. It's really rare, by the way. I only see about one case every 10 years. So be afraid of diabetes and atherosclerosis and hypertension. I see that tons of cases every day, all day long. This mad cow stuff, it's kind of scary, but it's rare. All right, here's an egg. And in the egg, got about 5 minutes. All right, in the egg, you got the egg yolk, which is where the baby chicken is. The egg white around is just this protein. And here's the unique thing about it. There's no iron in the egg white. So bacteria can actually get through the cell of an egg, but they can never get to the yolk to kill it. And here's why. Because there's no iron. In order for bacteria to grow, they need iron. And it's like a human. If you're walking through the desert, you're in a big problem because you got no water. A human can't walk that far in the desert because they don't have any water. And so just like a human can't survive without water, a bacteria cannot survive without iron. And guess what? What is cancer? Cancer is very much like an anaerobic bacteria. It's not quite that simple, but it's like a dedifferentiated transformation from an aerobic part of a multicellular organ system into being like an anaerobic bacteria. And guess what? Cancer needs lots of iron to grow. Why am I telling you this? Because humans who eat a lot of meat, they're iron overloaded. Plus, they put iron in everything. Fortified grains got iron in them. A lot of these multivitamins got iron in them. You don't want that. People in America tend to be way iron overloaded. Men start getting iron overloaded after 20. Women when they're postmenopausal, and it's actually a big deal. So here's a typical curve. Guy starts getting iron overloaded after 20. A woman, after she's postmenopausal, getting iron overloaded. And that's going to increase your risk of cognitive decline. It's also going to make your blood more prothrombotic potentially. You could check your blood ferritin. Like mine was 240 a couple years ago. I donated blood ×1. I did it in a stupid way. I just did it on a whim. Hey, I got some free time. I'll go donate blood. What I should have done was make sure I'm well hydrated first. And I also recommend the small, if you're going to donate blood, you don't have to. I just don't eat any dietary iron, and my iron's coming down. Now it's about 140, which I like it. I like it probably at around 100, but it's working its way down pretty nicely. It's considered normal. I don't know. Different places will have different levels. Let's say 350 or something, and less is normal. But ideally, I probably like mine to be between about 50 to 100. And that might be overdoing it, but we need to get it. And all I'm going to tell you is that you'll read some books and say, oh, blood donation was a pleasurable, enjoyable experience. You could even have a donor's high. BS. I didn't like it. I felt lightheaded afterwards. I had to lay down for a while. And like I said, I screwed up and I didn't hydrate myself well in advance. So I would have had big, juicy veins for the blood draw person. And I was in a hurry, which was stupid. And so you have to give yourself some time, be ready to lay down, be well hydrated if you're going to do it. And you don't need to do it. You check with your doctor, check your ferritin first, your hemoglobin first. But I'm just letting you know, the smartest thing is just don't keep adding iron. When you eat meat, you absorb 4 times as much iron as when you eat plant iron. Okay, that's why you want to avoid it. And this is one of the big problems with iron. The iron can redox cycle. It's a transitional metal. So it'll redox cycle. That means it has a variable valence. It'll redox cycle between Fe2 plus and Fe3 plus. And as it cycles between these different charge states, it'll interact with oxygen and produce reactive oxygens. And these reactive oxygens are free radicals, including hydroxyl radical with an unpaired electron in its outer orbital. And that'll damage lipids. That can damage your plasma membrane of cells, and it'll also damage mitochondrial membrane. So it's a big deal. Iron is like fire. You want fire at your house, in the fireplace, in the stove, but you don't want it anywhere else. It will destroy stuff. And that's what iron does in the body. So you don't want extra iron. Take home message, yeah, avoid excessive iron in your diet. Ooh. Oh, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I'll only make one comment on this. This is like all these football players. Some people recommend Mediterranean diet. No. You don't want Mediterranean diet. There's too much mercury in fish. There's a lady by the name of Jane Hightower. She's an MD around San Francisco area. She wrote a good book diagnosis mercury. She had all these brain damaged patients, and it was from eating mercury in the fish. She told them stop eating the fish, and their problems improved. You can read the book; it's a good book. Olive oil is a problem with. There's a lot of problems with Mediterranean diet. Esselstyn's diet was like 30 times better for cardiovascular prevention, even when it was under optimal circumstances. If you look at the Lyon study. All right, so let's see. I'll just see if I got anything really good. Here's this lipid peroxidation in the mitochondria. Primarily, it'll damage the cardiolipins. They got 4 tails on them, fatty acid tails, compared to a regular phospholipid. So the mitochondria is kind of prone to that. Normally, superoxide anions get neutralized by SOD, superoxide dismutase. These are just mitochondrial toxins. We don't really got time to go into that now, but they're things that'll inhibit your mitochondrial function. So getting back to what I was talking about, maintain good blood supply, avoiding all your hypertension, diabetes risk factors. Okay, you get your antioxidants from eating plants. Plant has antioxidants because it has to survive in the sun. There's no antioxidants in meat. There's no fiber in meat. Avoid these stimulants because they just make it harder for your neurons to meet their metabolic demands to get their oxygen and glucose delivery. Avoid these toxins, including the oils. This is that guy, Tetsumori Yamashima, who figured out why the Japanese were becoming demented from eating omega-6 oils. He's the one who also figured out the cooking oils, in his experience, were damaging the pancreas cells. And that's what I think a lot of the persons from India who were surprisingly healthy looking were maybe having more atherosclerotic problems than one would expect. And it appears to be due to that, but there might be other causes as well. Other stuff we talked about. Okay, and that's it. Hey, Paul, give me the sound.
Wow, Dr. Rogers, you are like an encyclopedia. Do you think you could take it off screen share for a moment so I could see you?
Yeah, take it off screen share if you could, bud.
It's just a little click of a button. Just stop share.
Stop share. Can you find it?
It should be at the, it's a green button at the top or the bottom.
Green button. Yeah, that's it.
It just, you just
Make
stop
it
share.
so you can see my entire self.
Yeah, stop share. It should
Just
be,
the webcam.
it's not on
Just
your,
stop
it's not
sharing
on your
completely and
presentation.
it'll
It's on
default
the,
to that.
it's on the bar. It just says stop share.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I can do
Try
it. I got it. But no, you stop. I'll do it if you stop doing it too.
Let her do it. Let her do it.
I got it. Okay, got it. Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Rogers, I know we started about 15 minutes late because you had some tech issues and I do have to teach today, but do you mind answering a few questions that were sent in by viewers in advance?
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. This first one, what brilliant presentation though, is from Rachel. She said, what is, for Dr. Rogers, what is your take on plastic nanoparticles getting on our skin from plastics such as plastic bags at the grocery stores? And what happens to these nanoparticles?
Well, I don't specifically know about the ones from plastic, but I do know they put nanoparticles in a lot of these sunscreens or other cosmetic products. And my advice would be to avoid them. I spoke with a physician who's a nuclear medicine expert, and he told me he doesn't know what the significance of those nanoparticles is. They're very small. Could they maybe cross the blood-brain barrier? I don't know for sure if they do, but I would not take a chance. A lot of times in life, we don't have 100% certainty of stuff. And you just say, is it worth the risk? And I would say probably not. So I try to avoid excessive contact with anything that I think could potentially be absorbed transdermally.
Thank you. Great answer. I appreciate that. And her second question is, do you believe our cell phones are emitting harmful radiation, or should we not worry about this?
Well, I think there's different types of cell phones, but the ones traditionally were low power microwave transmitters. So I would recommend not holding them up to your ear. I would use the speakerphone, and I would try to use them as seldom as possible and only use the speakerphone. Because what I've seen is a lot of people, they become obsessed with their cell phone and their text messages. Some people would even sleep with it next to their head. That's a stupid thing to do. So on the one hand, I think it's a bad idea to have it too much. And I'd also say you don't want it in your front pocket. It could potentially microwave your testicles and cause testicular atrophy. I don't like the idea of having it in your back pocket. I wonder if it might increase the risk of rectal cancer. I'm not sure that it does, but I'd be concerned about that. I also see a lot of women putting a cell phone in their front pocket. That might increase your risk of breast cancer. I'm not sure it will, but it doesn't seem wise to do that. I would keep it in like a bag separate from your body.
Wow, thank you. Jane would like to know, do you personally use a microwave and how do you feel about them?
No, I don't. I actually wanted to throw the darn thing away. And I laugh because Russia, which is, not the most high safety place, they banned them a long time ago. I became interested in electronic testing, around 20 years ago when I first got a house with kids. And I tested everything. The microwave gives off tremendous amounts of electromotive force, even when it's not on. When it's on, it's off the charts. If somebody insists on using a microwave in my house, I run out of the room. I make my kids and everyone else run out of the room because it's so powerful. Look what it does to a hamburger, okay? And then you say, well, it's shielded. Oh, really? Take a phone, put a phone inside the microwave and call it. It will ring. It'll always ring. So maybe it's just unshielded in the back. Well, sometimes people have a microwave in one room, and what if somebody's sleeping right behind you? You want to make sure everyone's a decent distance away from them. And the truth is, I don't think you need it. But if you insist on using it for whatever your personal reasons, I would at least get far away from it, and certainly not put plastic into it. And like I said, all these starches, I use boiled water to make them. But anyways.
Great, thank you. And Jean would like to know, what is your take on maca powder and mushroom powder?
Oh, I don't know anything about it.
Okay, thank you. And then Jane had another question. Is there any room in your Spartan diet for fermented foods such as soy sauce or natto, or for very low fat fermented pea protein powder? And do adults over 65 need to increase their protein intake?
I doubt it. That's kind of a big subject, but I doubt it, because I know you're going to hear different articles, and I haven't read on all the latest of that, but I know exercise makes people tremendously fit. Look at Ruth Heidrich, for example. She's running around doing triathlons in her 80s. Okay. I'm not a big fan of taking any types of powders. And I'm actually not that big a fan of soy either. I know some people really like it, and I know they're going to tell you the Asians eat soy, but they only ate a small amount, relatively unprocessed. When you start looking at the details of soy is complicated. Okay, it causes an increase in insulin-like growth factors. It also has a very high amounts of estrogen. I think flax is the only thing higher. It also has heme iron in it. So I wonder, are you absorbing more iron? I haven't studied exact amounts of iron absorption. It's also potentially goitrogenic. It's also high in fat. So I'm not a big fan of it, but I don't ever eat it myself.
I personally am allergic to it, so I don't eat it. But she also wanted to know that she said she saw one of your videos where you said you don't want any estrogen-like effects for yourself. But what about women after menopause? Maybe they should be having the soy?
Well, that's a complex subject. And the reason I go into it, there was a paper, which off the top of my head, I don't remember the specific reference, but a lot of people quoted this one particular paper saying, well, it only affects the so-called, like, I forget which one even, alpha or the beta receptor, the good receptor, but not the bad receptor. I actually went and looked at that paper. It affected both. And so I don't know if soy is as safe as people claim it is with regard to breast cancer. Now, again, I'm not an expert on the subject, but back in the past, I have reviewed the papers, and the impression I got from reviewing the paper was that it was activating both receptors. And given the fact that it's high in lipid, it increases insulin-like growth factor, and has heme, and it has a lot of estrogen effects, I would not be so sure. I don't gain. I always look at the risk-benefit ratio. Unless I'm going to, and a lot of times it's processed with hexane too. Unless I know I'm going to gain a lot from something, then why would I take any risks? I know there's some risks. So to me, I don't see a big gain. So I would just not bother with it.
Well, I appreciate, your dietary advice, and because we have so many people in the plant-based space that are pro oil, pro alcohol, so thanks. So Dr. Rogers, this question was sent in basically from a lady named Marilyn, and she said, you can ask this to any doctor. And it was such a good question. I've been asking it to most of the doctors when there's time, because I'm curious what you think about this. She says she's been eating mostly plant exclusive, except there's days she caves and eats something that is high in fat and sugar and highly processed, such as a Costco cake, which by the way isn't vegan, or something from the bakery. Her question is, how long do fatty, sugary foods stay in the body? And how does her blood and cholesterol levels stay elevated? And how long does it take to eliminate these things for her body to be back to a normal, healthy level? And how much of a setback can it cause your health efforts?
Well, a couple things. There was some work done by Peter Quo, a cardiologist in the 1950s, early 1960s, as well as two ophthalmologists, Friedman and Rosenman, where they would feed patient high-fat diets. And the ophthalmologist would look at the eye with an 80 times magnified microscope, and they would see after the high-fat diet impaired blood flow in the eye. And Quo took a bunch of patients with known cardiac angina, and he found that he would check their blood lipids every 30 minutes. And at peak lipemia, typically between 4 to 6 hours after eating sat fat, they would get all their cardiac chest pain, angina episodes. And then they said, well, there was a big craze around the early 1960s. Well, we're not going to eat sat fat anymore. We're going to eat omega-6 oils. These cooking oils, they're PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, and they're going to be safer. As it turned out, they caused even more sludging of the blood, and they had a more prolonged effect. Him and his workers, they started them out in the morning, and the effect was persisting after 8-9 hours. They go, forget this, we're going home. So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's a bad idea. In addition, one of the reasons why I showed those normal variants that are good to know about, like bilateral persistent fetal PCOM arteries, increasing your risk of stroke, is you don't know if you got those. And so I wouldn't mess around with it. Consider yourself being healthy as lucky, be grateful for it, and optimize things. Every individual can do what they want. But what I'm trying to say is I wouldn't take a chance on stuff. As we get older, we become more fragile. We have less nitric oxide vasodilator produced by our endothelial cells, for example. And so me personally, I would avoid that. And that's also why I like developing a personal philosophy of I'm grateful for my health and I'm going to do whatever I can to optimize it. And that'll give you the best chance to avoid everything. Because, cancer is caused by largely the same risk factors as atherosclerosis and almost all these chronic diseases. So I just personally, for me, I have no temptation. I'm very happy. Thank God for this vegan diet. We're not just a victim of aging, we're screwed and all these bad things are going to happen. No, most low-fat vegans, we die of old age.
Great. Dr. Rogers, you're just wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy you've decided to take a monthly slot starting Sunday, December 11th on the show.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back at 11 a.m. tomorrow when my guest is Dr. Jean-Jacques Wang. He works for the NIH. He has done amazing research in the field of obesity, and he is going to be talking about the brain-gut interaction in obese people in light of medical imaging. You don't want to miss that show. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.